Hello everyone. If you like this audiobook and want to listen to more, please consider subscribing. And if you like this video, like it as well, that it enjoy.
Chapter 16. The courtyard of the Eggenfort was packed tight with bodies, a writhing, noisy sea of wool, leather, steel, and unwashed humanity. Above the press of the crowd, perched high upon the broad stone balcony overlooking the bailey, I stood watching the crown prince prepare for his grand departure. Aenys sat tall in the high-cantled saddle atop Quicksilver, his slender frame draped in a tunic of shimmering silver cloth that caught the morning light. The young dragon beneath him shifted uneasily on the packed dirt, its scaled hide rippling like liquid pewter as it hissed a thin plume of gray smoke into the crisp air. Quicksilver was still remarkably small by the standards of the conquerors, beasts, slender and lightning fast, looking less like a continent-shattering engine of doom and more like a sleek, silver-scaled hound blessed with wings. The beast did not like the roaring throng of commoners, lords, and whispering courtiers any more than I did. Aenys turned his head upward, catching my eye from the balcony, and offered a bright, nervous smile before raising a gloved hand in farewell. I waved back lazily, leaning against the cold stone balustrade. He was heading east toward Duskendale, where King Aegon was currently holding court amidst his royal progress, waiting for his eldest son to join the royal train. The crowds watched with bated breath, waiting for the great moment. With a sharp, whispered command in the old, melodic tongue of Valyria, Aenys spurred his mount. Quicksilver let out a piercing shriek that rattled the teeth in my skull, beat its vast, shimmering wings against the earth, and launched itself heavily into the sky. The dragon swept upward in a magnificent, soaring arc, banking gracefully before vanishing entirely among the low-hanging gray clouds drifting in from Blackwater Bay. The courtyard let out a collective sigh of awe, the tension breaking as the spectators slowly began to disperse back to their daily toil. I let out a long, quiet breath of my own, tracking the empty patch of sky where the silver wings had just disappeared. I could hardly wait to get my massive, scaly hands on a dragon of my own. Valerian, my ancient, terrifying friend, please wait for me. Now, I was certainly not the kind of malicious person to actively wish an untimely demise upon my own father. However, time and tide wait for no man, and neither do colossal fire-breathing lizards. Are you going to come with us, or are you just going to stand there staring at the clouds all day? I leaned my weight away from the balcony, turning my head to see who was disturbing my villainous musings. It was none other than Davos Baratheon, his thick black hair sticking up in sweaty tufts, wearing a broad, gap-toothed grin as he beckoned me toward the shadowy mouth of the corridor. "Where are you all even going?" I asked, stepping off the stonework and following him, pausing for a fraction of a second as a mangy, dirt-caked alley cat darted past our boots. "Just somewhere out in the deep woods surrounding the city," Davos answered over his shoulder, his voice dropping to an excited conspiratorial whisper. "We spotted a massive hornet nest hanging out there yesterday afternoon. Thought we might go poke it." What do 10-year-old aristocratic boys actually do in a brutal, medieval fantasy world when left entirely to their own devices? I suppose we had our definitive answer right here. They were not fundamentally different from modern kids back on Earth, though the children of my old world spent 90% of their waking hours staring blankly at glowing glass rectangles, rotting their brains on short-form video algorithms. How desperately sad. Those poor modern children would never be able to experience the pure, earthy, unadulterated pleasure of aggressively shoving a fistful of wet soil into their mouths. Dirt, rich, mineral-heavy, absolute culinary perfection. "Wait a minute," I said, quickening my pace to match his stride as we navigated the dim stone hallways. "Did your personal guards actually let you walk out here without trailing 10 yards behind you like overprotective shadowhounds?" I glanced back over my shoulder. True to form, my own designated shadow guard was lurking quietly down the corridor, keeping a respectful distance because Queen Visenya treated domestic security with the terrifying paranoia of an empress guarding a hoard of stolen gold. I wasn't bothered by the surveillance in the slightest. In fact, I could already see the invisible narrative gears turning in the background. This was my very first official outing with my peer group, which meant the universe was contractually obligated to throw an ambush at us. Since my guard would inevitably be lagging behind or conveniently distracted, the highborn boys would simply have to strap on their figurative testicles and fight for survival without any adult backup. I see right through your predictable plot tropes, reality. Well, there's no one currently in the solar to tell them otherwise, is there? Davos raised his arms above his head for a dramatic stretch, the mischievous grin spreading even wider across his flushed face. "It feels magnificent being out here without my mother and father hovering over my shoulder, constantly scolding me and disrupting every single thing I try to accomplish. They really ought to understand that I am a fully grown man now." He puffed out his chest with an air of supreme, childish dignity. I wisely decided to keep my mouth firmly shut regarding the minor biological technicality that he was only 11 years old and still cried when he skinned his knees during sword practice. Davos stepped closer, tilting his head with a curious frown. "Maegor, why do you never go on the royal processions with your father and Prince Aenys? Is it because you do not have a dragon of your own yet to fly alongside them? If I were an actual, emotionally fragile 5-year-old toddler, I would have likely burst into violent tears right then and there, throwing a royal temper tantrum on the flagstones. Fortunately for everyone involved, my brain was running on modern software. Instead, I offered a casual, nonchalant shrug of my shoulders. I think it is far more important for the common folk and the lords of the realm to look at who is actually going to handle the administrative heavy lifting in the coming years rather than trailing behind a secondary prince, I replied smoothly. The young Baratheon frowned deeply, his brows knitting together as he looked like he wanted to argue or perhaps blurt out something disrespectful about Aenys. Then, spotting a pair of royal stewards walking past down the hall, he intelligently shut his mouth with a sharp click of his teeth. Clearly, the high-born kids running around the Egenfort were a lot sharper than I gave them credit for. The average 10-year-old from my old world would have screamed political treason at the top of their lungs without pausing to think about the consequences. Honestly, I had to hand it to King Aegon. Fostering all the eldest sons and primary nephews of the most powerful lords right here in the capital was an absolute masterclass in geopolitical hostage-taking. It made it ridiculously easy for me to infiltrate their social circles and build a spiderweb of early influence. Not that I was planning anything nefarious, of course. After several minutes of winding through the bustling streets of King's Landing while engaging in casual chatter, which mostly consisted of Davos refusing to shut up about his dramatic tales of daily sword drills and hunting mishaps, we finally reached the edge of the sprawling, untamed forest just beyond the city limits. Getting out there was remarkably easy because the surrounding area was still heavily wooded, blanketed by a dense sea of ancient oaks and towering pines thanks to the relatively low urban population and the complete absence of massive outer walls dictating who could come and go. The air changed instantly as we stepped beneath the emerald canopy, smelling rich and heavy with the scent of damp earth, rotting leaves, pine sap, and distant horse manure. Waiting for us near the trunk of a massive gnarled oak were Steffan Darklyn and Tristan Strong, already deep into a violently passionate argument that looked like it was about to turn into a full-scale wrestling match. Obviously, heavy cavalry is the single most important arm of any respectable military force, argued Steffan Darklyn, throwing his arms wildly into the air to emphasize his point as he jammed an accusatory finger right into Tristan's chest. A dense wedge of heavily armored knights riding atop thundering warhorses can easily shatter and rout any infantry formation ever conceived. And if you dare say anything against that absolute military truth, then it clearly proves you know less about grand strategy than a blind mule. That is complete and utter dragon shit, Tristan Strong roared back, his face turning the color of a bruised plum as he clenched his fists. Infantry is inherently superior because it is vastly more versatile. Tell me, oh great tactical genius, can your precious cavalry charge through a deep, waterlogged bog of thick mud and sucking swamps in the treacherous riverlands? Tristan gritted his teeth so hard a vein bulged furiously on his temple. Yes, they can, Steffan shouted back defensively, puffing out his chest with smug arrogance. You just have to be more motivated. That is not how warfare works, Tristan shrieked, throwing his hands up toward the sky in utter, soul-crushing exasperation before dramatically collapsing backward onto the mossy ground and sitting there in a sulk. Ah, the timeless, universally applicable internet argument format. My imaginary character or faction is infinitely stronger than yours simply because they are my personal favorite. It appeared that no matter which dimension, century, or magical fantasy universe you traveled to, certain fundamental human truths remained entirely unchanged. Just admit to everyone here that your tactical reasoning is completely stupid and that you have utterly lost the debate, Steffan gloated, crossing his arms over his chest with an irritatingly smug smirk. Tristan let out an animalistic growl of pure frustration, digging his fingers deep into the damp dirt beneath him as the other boys snickered. Before the verbal sparring could escalate into actual bloodshed, the rustling underbrush parted with a sharp snap, and two more figures emerged from the tree line. It was Demon Velaryon and Edwell Celtigar, swaggering over to join our little expedition with matching grins of absolute superiority plastered across their faces. Demon's pale silver-blonde hair caught the stray shafts of sunlight filtering through the leaves, while Edwell looked like a sullen, seasalted fish dragged straight out of Blackwater Bay. You are both standing here shouting and groaning like a pair of illiterate swine arguing over scraps, Demon announced loudly, striding right into the center of our circle with a dramatic flourish of his woolen cloak. The true masters of warfare are the naval fleets. A mighty war galley can bypass your silly, pathetic mud swamps entirely, sail straight up every navigable river in Westeros, and burn your precious cavalry to absolute ash while you lot are still busy fumbling with your saddle straps. Edwell Celtigar nodded along sagely, his dark sea-green tunic rustling as he crossed his arms. Precisely. A single well-placed broadside of boiling oil and heavy stone shot from a majestic droman would turn both your sweating horses and your muddy foot soldiers into floating fishfoot in less than an hour. Steffan Darklyn turned an alarming shade of deep, incandescent purple. You live on a glorified volcanic rock in the middle of a salty bay, Demon. Your entire grand military strategy consists entirely of getting violently seasick and vomiting your breakfast over the railing of a wooden boat. At least our boots do not smell like stable manure. Demon snapped right back. Instantly, the debate fractured into a deafening four-way screaming match, with each high-born brat shouting utter, unadulterated nonsense just to rage-abate the others. The volume reached an ear-splitting pitch before all four of them suddenly stopped, turning their heated gazes toward me as if I were the supreme arbiter of military doctrine sent down by the gods themselves. "My prince," Tristan demanded, pointing a finger at me from his spot on the dirt. "Tell them, which branch of the armed forces reigns supreme in true war?" I let out a slow, heavy sigh, rubbing the bridge of my nose as I looked around at the circle of eager, flushed faces. "It entirely depends on the terrain, the strategic logistics, the weather conditions, the enemy commander, and whether or not your opponent decided to bring a flying nuclear weapon to the battlefield, you absolute, drooling donkeys," I deadpanned, shaking my head at their sheer collective lack of perspective. The boys blinked, processing my overly complex modern answer for a second before they wisely decided to drop the grand strategy debate in favor of more immediate, highly destructive entertainment. "Right, well, never mind all that boring book learning," Davos said brightly, clapping his hands together and turning around to point up into the heavy, twisting branches of a towering, ancient oak tree hanging over the path. "Look right up there, that is the bastard hornet nest we were telling you about." We all craned our necks backward, squinting up through the dense canopy. Dangling precariously from a high, thin bough some 30 feet above our heads was a massive, swollen gray sphere constructed of chewed wood pulp and paper. It looked like an ugly, oversized tumor clinging to the tree, and even from down below, we could clearly hear the ominous, angry bass hum of thousands of striped, venomous stinging bastards swarming restlessly around the entrance hole. "We have been standing down here trying to knock that bloody thing down for an entire hour," Edwell Celtigar grumbled, rubbing a tender, bruised shoulder where a poorly thrown river rock had missed its mark and bounced off his own collarbone instead. "Every single time one of us hurls a stone, it either flies wide by 6 feet or bounces harmlessly off a twig like a pebble dropped on a knight's steel shield." I stared at them with a look of profound, soul-deep disappointment. Did these kids actually have nothing better to do than this? Oh wait, they actually did not. Without uttering a single word of warning, I stepped past the cluster of bewildered future lords, scanning the forest floor until my eyes landed on a dense, perfectly smooth, EGG-sized river stone half-buried in the moss. I bent down, scooped it up, and weighed it in my palm. Perfect balance, perfect density. I squared my stance, dropped my center of gravity, adjusted my grip, and tracked the invisible arc in the air leading straight to the stout branch supporting the heavy paper mass. The other boys watched me in utter silence, sensing a sudden shift in the atmosphere. With a sharp, fluid snap of my wrist and a violent rotation of my hips, I whipped my arm upward, hurling the stone with blistering, calculated speed. Thwack! The stone struck the upper wooden bough right beside the stem with a crisp, deafening crack that echoed sharply through the quiet woods. The heavy gray hornet nest shuddered violently on impact, its fragile anchor fibers snapping like dry twigs. Before anyone could even blink, the massive papery sphere detached completely from the branch and began plummeting straight down toward the earth with terrifying, unmitigated acceleration. The silence lasted for precisely half a second. Then, the nest smashed violently against a protruding root right at our feet, bursting open like a rotten melon. A thick, roiling, pitch-black cloud of thousands upon thousands of furiously vibrating, incredibly pissed-off hornets erupted from the ruined paper wreckage like an angry volcanic ash plume. The high-pitched, collective buzzing sound that filled the clearing instantly shifted from a low hum to a blood-curdling, apocalyptic shriek of pure vengeance. My brain instantly overrode my royal Valyrian composure, triggering every single primal fight-or-flight survival reflex wired into human DNA. "Oh, sweet mother of mercy, run for your lives." Without wasting a single millisecond on informing the others, I spun on my heel, tucked my arms, and bolted back toward the city gates faster than a startled hare. Behind me, the collective shriek of 5 highborn future lords pierced the afternoon air. "Run, run, they are going to eat our faces." The thunderous sound of 10 panicked boots scrambling over roots, tripping over moss, and crashing through thick underbrush filled the woods. I glanced back over my shoulder just once to see a swirling black cloud of angry demons hot on our heels, relentlessly pursuing the fleeing nobility of Westeros. Davos, Stefan, Tristan, Demon, and Edwell were all screaming at the absolute top of their lungs, sprinting for their lives with tears of pure terror streaming down their red faces, absolutely abandoning every single lesson on chivalry, bravery, and knightly valor they had ever been taught. As we burst out of the tree line and came barreling back toward the safety of the city gates, leaving a trail of dropped wooden swords and flying dirt in our wake, I couldn't even help the laugh bubbling up inside my throat. This was what life was all about. Kicking the shit out of kids. Chapter 17. Damn, these kids are good at this. I sat cross-legged on a battered wooden stool that wobbled with every shift of my weight, staring down once more at the detailed analysis of underworld secrets scrawled across a torn and filthy scrap of parchment. The sheepskin was yellowed with age and stained with what looked suspiciously like old mutton grease and spilled small beer. The handwriting was crude, shaky, and jagged, clearly scratched out by a hand that had spent far more time gripping a pickpocketed coin than a quill. The writer was barely literate, spelling words with cheerful phonetic abandon, but the crude letters were sharp enough for me to decipher every juicy, scandalous detail hidden within the text. How a bunch of grubby street rats had even managed to acquire a sheet of parchment, a commodity more precious than silver in these reeking slums, and find someone capable of stringing sentences together was a mystery for the ages. As for the secrets themselves, they were a magnificent cocktail of petty neighborhood gossip and genuinely dangerous criminal conspiracies. There were whimsical little nuggets of local filth, such as the tavern keeper down on Eel Street who loudly advertised his famous savory bird stew to the gullible masses while secretly butchering and boiling fat wharf rats caught down by the drainage pipes to pad his profit margins. There was the burly hammersmith whose shop sat directly across from a cobbler, a man who faithfully strapped on his leather apron every morning only to sneak out under the cloak of night to visit the expensive brothels on the street of Silk while cheating on his long-suffering wife. What the smithy did not know, of course, was that his pious wife had a secret lover of her own tucked away in the loft whenever the forge fires went cold. Then there were the truly foul characters padding out the margins of the report. A traveling bard from the sun-drenched reach had been making his lazy way from tavern to tavern day after day, strumming his lute and using every ounce of greasy charm in his arsenal to seduce every naive young maid foolish enough to listen to his romantic ballads. The rogue had managed to get a 13-year-old girl pregnant with a bastard child while swearing up and down on the seven that he would marry her before skipping town, though his actual plan involved running like a coward toward Dragonstone at the first hint of daylight. Beside that sordid tale were a few entries so utterly ridiculous and depraved that they made me seriously doubt whether they were clever slanders concocted by rival gangs or actual slices of medieval reality. One entry claimed the local stable owner was engaging in explicit nocturnal affections with his prized riding mares, while another whispered of a wealthy local cuckold who enjoyed standing in his own doorway and inviting passing strangers to take his wife for the evening. There was so much chaotic noise and random garbage cluttering the page that it took me several long hours of careful filtering to extract the nuggets of intelligence that actually mattered and held a ring of cold truth. There was a particularly juicy case of harbor corruption involving a high-ranking customs official who had gladly accepted a heavy pouch of silver stags to look the other way. The harbor master had knowingly permitted a massive oak barrel supposedly filled with harmless sweet arbor wine to pass uninspected into the heart of King's Landing, when the heavy cask was actually crammed to the wooden staves with banned Valerian poisons and unregistered cohoric steel blades. Then there was the pious missionary of the Faith of the Seven, a high-ranking holy man dispatched straight from the Reach to preach rigid moral purity and temperance in the royal court every single morning, only to sneak out and visit the seediest brothels 3 times a week under the cover of darkness. What was wrong with the people hailing from the Reach that made them such hypersexual hypocrites? Did none of them actually bother to read the holy texts they waved about, or was mandatory celibacy just a polite suggestion for everyone except the peasants? The parchment also listed a terrifying catalogue of systemic corruption crawling through the ranks of the city watch. It made grim sense when you considered that there was no centralized, professional governing body to whip the gold cloaks into shape, divide them into proper regiments, or enforce a strict chain of command. The city guards were running rampant with unchecked bribery, shaking down frightened merchants for copper protection money, operating underground dice and blood-fighting rings in abandoned cellars, and taking whatever they wanted from helpless citizens without any fear of royal justice. I set the long, grease-stained sheet of parchment down on the wobbly wooden table and let out a long, weary sigh, rubbing my thumb and forefinger against my aching forehead. Slowly lifting my gaze, I stared across the dim, lanternlit cellar at the ragged assembly of street urchins standing expectantly in the shadows. Just how many people do you grease-stained little bastards even have working for you across this entire wretched city? I asked, my voice carrying a dry, flat note of disbelief. Pate shifted his weight from one scuffed boot to the other, blinking his wide, suspicious eyes. He glanced around at the motley crew of ragged children clustered behind him in the gloom. Do not rightly know, my lord. We just told every cutpurse, runner, and stable boy we know to keep their eyes wide open and report back whatever juicy bits they could dig up from the gutters. I looked over the cluster of kids again, counting at least 10 distinct bodies crammed into the tiny, foul-smelling room. Why on earth had Pate brought such a small army of witnesses to our clandestine meeting? A cynical voice in the back of my modern mind whispered that perhaps he planned to double-cross me, refuse my terms, or signal his older cutthroat friends to jump me in the dark and rob me blind. Yet I took one look at their scrawny arms, dirt-caked cheeks, and threadbare tunics, and almost laughed aloud at the absurdity of the thought. It instantly reminded me of those ridiculous internet hypothetical debates from my previous life, where people endlessly argued over how many 5-year-old children an average adult male could successfully defeat in unarmed combat before getting completely overwhelmed by sheer numbers. I had always firmly believed that I could easily take at least 20 of them without breaking a sweat, and looking at this shivering lot, my confidence remained entirely unshaken. Realizing that I had fallen into a deep, meditative silence for far too long, I cleared my throat and broke the quiet. And tell me, or all of you wretched little orphans are genuine street rats born and raised in the filth of Flea Bottom? Pate swallowed hard, nervously shifting his weight back to his left foot. Not truly, m'lord. While all of us here are just kids trying to survive, a few have families living in the better districts, and some even sneak out from doing menial kitchen work inside the royal castle itself. Nodding slowly as I weighed his words, I slid my hand deep into the heavy leather coin pouch hanging at my belt, my fingers instantly finding the smooth, heavy edges of a genuine gold dragon. I pulled it out into the dim candlelight. The moment the rich yellow metal caught the faint amber glow, every single pair of hungry eyes in the room locked onto it with the laser-like intensity of starving wolves staring at a fresh kill. Money in Westeros was a profoundly weird concept, especially when you consider the economic laws laid down by the great Maester George himself. While anyone paying attention already knew that the old man was notoriously terrible with numbers and scale, his financial inconsistencies became painfully hilarious the moment you looked at the currency. A single gold dragon was a staggering fortune for a common working man, enough to purchase a fully trained warhorse, acquire a magnificent suit of tempered steel chainmail, or comfortably fund a skilled artisan and his entire household for an entire year. Yet, at the same time, Grand Lords like Robert Baratheon would casually toss around 20 or 40,000 gold dragons in a single weekly tourney prize purse as if the coins were copper pennies dropped down a well. The macroeconomics made less sense than a fantasy novel written by a hyperactive squirrel, but value was entirely a matter of collective delusion. Weighing the heavy disc of gold in my palm for a final moment, I flicked my wrist and tossed it through the air. Pate lunged forward with the frantic reflexes of a starving alley cat, catching the heavy coin cleanly between his two palms before it could hit the filthy floor. "That is your pay for this month of intelligence gathering," I instructed, letting my gaze sweep slowly across every single face in the room so that every last urchin knew I was honoring the bargain. "Make sure you distribute the shares equally among yourselves. Continue the network, keep your ears pressed against every tavern wall in the city, and if the quality of your secrets remains this high, I will double your payout next month." Without waiting for a chorus of grateful murmurs or groveling bows, I pushed myself up off the wobbly wooden stool, turned my back on the assembly, and strode toward the heavy oak door of the dilapidated hovel. I pulled it open and stepped out into the damp, choking alleyways of the district that would eventually earn the grim, permanent moniker of Flea Bottom. Was it genuinely a wise tactical decision to hand a small fortune in solid gold over to a pack of ambitious street urchins? Probably not. It was the kind of reckless move that usually ended with someone getting a rusty dagger slipped between their ribs in a dark alley when the kids realized how much wealth they were handling. Only time would tell if things would deteriorate into absolute chaos or blossom into an effective espionage network. There was also the terrifying risk that if someone caught wind of my little shadow operation, the blame would fall squarely on my tiny royal shoulders, which would initiate a massive domestic crisis. Once again, only time would provide the definitive answer to whether this dangerous gamble was worth the trouble. "What on earth are you planning to do with that filthy piece of parchment tucked into your doublet, my prince?" A low, gravelly voice rumbled from the shadows beside the alley wall. I turned my head to find Sir Humphrey standing at attention, his heavy steel plate armor clanking softly as he shifted his weight. The veteran knight looked completely ridiculous standing in the middle of a reeking alleyway, radiating an aura of lethal, armored competence that made passing beggars cross to the other side of the dirt road in abject terror. I reached down, slipping my fingers into my pocket to stroke the rough, grease-stained edges of the secret-filled report. "I am going to hand it directly to my mother," I answered smoothly, offering the knight a very wicked little smile. "I certainly hope those dirty little street rats were telling the truth." Chapter 18. The gardens of the Red Keep were a deceptive place, smelling sweetly of blooming jasmine and crushed mint while sitting atop a cliff of cold gray stone that overlooked the churning, gray-green waters of Blackwater Bay. I sat upon a low stone bench shaded by trailing grapevines, a block of seasoned applewood in my left hand and a short, razor-sharp iron dagger in my right. It was a remarkably peaceful evening, the kind of quiet hour where a man might almost forget that half the lords in the realm were currently plotting treason, poisoning their rivals, or marrying off their daughters for a sack of turnips and a rusty breastplate. The air was cool against my skin, carrying a faint tang of salt and ancient dust, and the surrounding plants rustled gently in the breeze. What made the whole scene truly magnificent, however, was the gloriously fat, midnight black tomcat currently sprawled across my lap like a melting pool of ink. Ah, life is genuinely good when you have a warm, fat bastard occupying your thighs and zero immediate responsibilities demanding your attention. People back in my old world would have cheerfully murdered their own grandmothers for an opportunity like this, and to be entirely honest, I probably would have done the same. That was precisely why I tried to savor every single ridiculous moment of this bizarre second chance. Who could possibly guess how long it would take for some random dysentery, a stray crossbow bolt, or a jealous uncle to violently cut my existence short in a savage, godforsaken world like this one? Hopefully, I would last a very long time, maybe even clear a century or two, though expecting a medieval peasant's dietary baseline to support a cyborg lifespan was pushing my luck. Even if I somehow managed to drag this feudal rock kicking and screaming into an industrial revolution, some fundamental truths of existence would remain utterly impossible to fix. Not that living forever was some grand, romantic dream of mine anyway. To my sensibilities, true immortality sounded like a profoundly lonely, tortuous existence, sitting on a lonely rock while you watch all your friends, lovers, and descendants die off one by one until you are the only idiot left standing at the end of time. To me, living forever was a cosmic curse, something I wouldn't wish upon my absolute worst enemy, though admittedly I did not hate anyone enough to curse them with eternal life. The absolute worst part of immortality would probably be drifting aimlessly through dead, freezing space after the cold death of the universe had utterly obliterated every star, planet, and galaxy in existence. As I sat there brooding over the cosmic heat death of the cosmos, long, curly shavings of pale applewood cascaded from my knife blade, raining down softly onto the fat black cat sleeping in my lap. Within minutes, its sleek black fur was thoroughly blanketed by a heavy layer of sawdust and wood curls, making the beast look like a bizarre, furry pastry dusted with powdered sugar. I kept carving away at the hollow piece of cylindrical wood, my thumb sliding smoothly along the surface which had grown satiny and warm from repeated friction. Some work still needed to be done before it would produce anything resembling a proper note. Alas, it was going to take me an agonizingly long time to shape the bore correctly simply because the proper precision tools did not exist anywhere within 1,000 leagues of this damp castle. As for what exactly I was crafting in total secrecy, it was a simple wooden flute. While I had never formally taken lessons on wood carving, a flute seemed simple enough to figure out through trial and error. You just needed to hollow out a tube, shape the embouchure hole, and space the finger holes correctly along the barrel. Did flutes even exist in Westeros yet? I honestly did not think so, though perhaps some exotic bards carried them in distant, decadent trade cities like Yet across the narrow sea, but they were certainly unheard of among the illiterate brutes living on this continent. Then again, maybe flutes did exist and I had simply forgotten about them because they were utterly minor details in the grand sweep of history. Picking up the rough wooden cylinder, I placed my fingertips against the curved surface to estimate the spacing, marking out the positions for the stops with the tip of my dagger. To craft a truly magnificent, resonant flute, I really needed to get my hands on some hollow bamboo stalks, but those slender tropical grasses certainly did not grow wild on the windswept cliffs of King's Landing. Still, this seasoned applewood would work well enough for a rustic, side-blown wooden pipe reminiscent of the simple instruments carved by forest dwellers. There you well are. The sharp, feminine voice shattered the quiet tranquility of the garden and startled me so badly that my hand jerked. The knife blade slipped, narrowly avoiding slicing clean through the side of the flute body. I let out a long, shaky breath, thanking whatever invisible guardian angel watched over careless idiots that I had managed to stop the blade in time to save hours of tedious carving. Turning my head toward the source of the interruption, I found none other than Alyssa Velaryon striding down the gravel path, her golden hair glowing like spun copper under the warm rays of the fading sun. It took me a full second to realize she wasn't yelling at me, but rather glaring down at the furry disaster currently buried under a drift of wood shavings in my lap. "You're searching all over the keep for him again, aren't you?" I asked lazily, pointing my chin at the fat black cat, who hadn't even bothered to twitch an ear at the commotion. Alyssa stopped beside the stone bench, nodding vigorously as her slightly curled ringlets bobbed up and down with the motion. "Ever since you gave this little monster to me, he refuses to stay put in my solar. He keeps slipping out the window every time my maids turn their backs, and I have to chase him all over the bailey." Her lips were downturned in an adorable pout of sheer frustration as she sank down onto the grass beside the bench, her bright blue dress rustling softly as the fabric smoothed against the dirt. "I suppose he just has an adventurous soul and likes to be free," I offered with an innocent shrug. "Yeah, I really doubted that. The only adventurous things this fat bastard could like was maybe venturing out into the kitchens." She shook her head with a wry smile, looking down past my hands to study the sleeping cat. Her dark eyebrows raised in sudden amusement as she finally noticed that the animal was completely coated in a thick layer of pale sawdust. Flicking her curious purple gaze upward from the cat to the hollow piece of wood resting in my fingers, the young Velaryon tilted her head. "What on earth are you making there, Maegor?" I turned the wooden cylinder over in my palm, examining the grain before holding it out toward her, our fingers accidentally brushing against each other in the warm evening air. She furrowed her smooth brow in deep concentration as she took the piece of wood, rotating it between her fingers and running her delicate hands over the smooth, sanded surface. "Is this supposed to be some sort of weapon?" She handed it back to me, her striking purple eyes locking onto mine with a sharp twinge of suspicion and curiosity flickering in their depths. "Well, in the hands of a sufficiently unhinged person, almost anything can be used as a lethal weapon if you try hard enough, I replied with a lazy shrug, balancing the wood back down on the fat back of the sleeping cat. The sudden movement caused a small avalanche of wood chips to slide off the cat's furry back and tumble into the grass as I tried to balance my project. Alyssa snorted softly, her lips spreading into a bright, genuine smile as she reached out and hit me a playful smack on the shoulder. I dramatically winced and clutched my arm as if I had been struck by a warhammer, only for her to roll her eyes and hit me again for good measure. Stop acting like that and just tell me what it is before I lose patience. Keep your royal skirts on, I chuckled, dodging a third swipe with my arms raised. It's supposed to be a musical instrument. An instrument, she repeated, her head tilting to the side in confusion. I nodded encouragingly in response. She stared at the carved cylinder again. Is it supposed to be a piece of something much bigger like a harp or a drum? It doesn't look like any instrument I've ever seen in the keep. Smirking, I traced the faint outline of the embouchure hole with my thumb. You will see when it is finally finished. The sound it makes will be completely unlike anything you or anyone else in this damp castle has ever heard before. The girl raised a deeply skeptical eyebrow at my bold declaration, though a hint of intrigue lingered in her expression. She shrugged carelessly and leaned back against the stone base of the bench. Well then, I suppose I shall just have to wait around for you to complete your mysterious project. Humming softly in agreement, I picked up my iron knife and set back to work, smoothing down the exterior curves of the wood. The applewood felt good in my grip, smooth and cool, though it could definitely use a bit more fine-tuning before I burned the tone holes through. The black cat let out a deep, rumbling purr from my lap, its heavy, warm mass spreading out across my thighs as if it weighed 50 pounds. Clearly, the furry black bastard thoroughly enjoyed being covered in fresh wood shavings, and it was a public service I was more than happy to continue providing. I continued to carve in comfortable silence, deliberately ignoring the way Alyssa kept staring at my face with a look of intense contemplation. There were far more important things for a growing prince to worry about than the lingering gaze of a high-born girl. Crafting this flute was mostly an exercise in reclaiming a tiny sliver of emotional sanity through sentimental value rather than serving any practical political purpose. While people back home might assume that being magically reincarnated into a brutal medieval fantasy world would be endlessly thrilling, the reality of it was often tedious, punctuated by moments of stark terror. My early toddler years had been an absolute psychological nightmare of royal paranoia and damp swaddling clothes, but my current life was packed so tightly with daily responsibilities that I barely had a spare moment to get bored. Between rigorous physical training with veteran knights, bantering with the other aristocratic boys in the corridors, driving the castle servants half insane with my modern sarcastic wit, and studying grand strategy, my schedule was completely maxed out. Still, taking an hour to carve a simple wooden pipe felt like a necessary anchor to keep my sanity intact. Do you ever wonder who you are going to end up getting betrothed to, Maegor? Alyssa asked suddenly, shattering the quiet atmosphere of the garden. There was a strange, guarded expression flickering across her features as she posed the question. I paused my knife blade mid-stroke, taking a moment to carefully contemplate my answer before speaking. I turned the wood over in my fingers. Since I am only the second son of the king, there will not be nearly as many rigid political restrictions placed on my marriage options compared to Amy's. Because I don't have to carry the entire weight of the succession on my shoulders, I will probably get to marry someone I actually care about, or perhaps take more than one wife if the mood strikes me, who knows? I answered simply, picking right back up where I left off with the wood shaving. The exterior surface was nearly as smooth as glass now, meaning the delicate work of burning out the finger holes was fast approaching. The young Velaryon stared at me in absolute, open-mouthed shock upon hearing my casual declaration. She sputtered for a second, her eyes widening to the size of silver stags as she processed the words. 2 wives? I offered an easy, unbothered shrug, though internally I couldn't help but wonder why she was acting so astounded in a dynasty founded by a guy who literally married 2 sister wives at the same time. That is honestly on the lower end. If my royal father could openly take 2 wives and rule half the continent, why shouldn't I do the exact same thing when I grow up? Bitches be scared, because I am coming for you. Alyssa continued to sit there gaping at me like a fish dragged out of Blackwater Bay, her jaw hanging slack as she tried to reconcile my absurd statement with reality. After several long, agonizing moments of stunned silence, she finally managed to reboot her brain, leaning back against the bench and shaking her head with a mixture of disbelief and amusement. Seeing that she was temporarily rendered speechless, I happily returned my attention to the applewood cylinder. I do not even know what to say to you anymore, she whispered, pausing before shaking her head again with a small, helpless smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. You are such a weird boy, Maegor. Once more, she let out a soft sigh, staring at me for a beat longer before throwing her head back and bursting into bright, musical laughter that echoed off the gray stone walls of the courtyard. I waited patiently for her laughing fit to subside before offering a nonchalant shrug. Weird is good, and being eccentric is even better. It simply means you aren't boring, or mediocre. Setting the half-finished flute down on the bench for a moment, I leaned back and looked over at Alyssa, who was studying me with a strange, complicated mixture of amusement and deep admiration shining in her purple eyes. The moment made me pause, forcing me to reflect briefly on my previous life. Every single calculated move I made, every secret network I built, and every eccentric hobby I picked up stemmed from an overwhelming desire to be fundamentally different, to rise above the miserable herd. I refused to live like the wretched masses who sleepwalked through their entire existence without ambition, trapped forever in a dismal purgatory of mediocrity and ambiguity. The unexamined life is truly not worth living. To my way of thinking, human existence was entirely about seizing every available opportunity by the throat and wringing every drop of agency out of the universe. The moment a man gave up on that relentless drive and settled for the path of least resistance was the moment he spiritually died. In a strange way, it reminded me of those famous historical quotes attributed to Napoleon Bonaparte, where he explained that he spent his youth buried in dark cafes and dusty libraries, reading and studying until there simply were nothing left to learn. To settle for ordinary in a world as brutal, bloody, and unforgiving as this one was nothing more than slowly dying by degrees. I stated simply. Well, Alyssa murmured softly, breaking the lingering silence as she reached over to gently pat the head of the sleeping black cat, which didn't even twitch its sawdust-covered ears. If your mysterious wooden flute turns out to be half as pretentious as your grand speeches about destiny, I suppose it might actually be worth listening to. Oh, it will be magnificent, I promised her with a grin, picking up my knife once more to carve the final details into the wood. Just you wait. Why could no one appreciate my motivational, main character speeches? Maybe giving them to a 10-year-old wasn't the best idea. Chapter 19. I lazed around on my feather bed, lazily twirling the plumbata between my fingers. How terribly sad, considering I had not yet gotten the golden opportunity to poke some unsuspecting bastard with it. Come on, where were all the juicy clichés when you actually needed them to spice up life? There were no secret face-changing assassins trying to slip a poisoned blade between my ribs in the dead of night, and nobody was jumping out of the damp stone shadows when I strolled through the twisting corridors of the Red Keep. Does no one in this entire feudal shithole care about poor old Maegor, the neglected second son of the realm? Probably not, and to be fair, I had been deliberately trying my best to avoid making dangerous enemies, not that I could easily cultivate a blood feud at the ripe old age of 5 years old. Even my royal father, the great conqueror himself, managed to avoid getting himself violently murdered for the most part, though if the bloody war with Dorne had still been dragging on right now, I would have likely been terminated by a stealthy dose of scorpion venom slipped into my morning goat milk. Dirty, backstabbing Dornishman, never trust those plotters, which was the #1 lesson drilled into my head by reading a few too many fantasy doorstoppers. There were 2 absolute, non-negotiable rules for surviving in this fictional universe. Rule number 1, never trust the salt-licked, reaving maniacs of the Iron Islands. Rule number 2, never trust the sunbaked, spear-wielding vipers of Dorne. Naturally, there were a few auxiliary guidelines worth considering as well, such as committing total, unmitigated genocide against both the Ironborn and the Dothraki screamers across the narrow sea. It is not like anyone with an ounce of common sense would miss those bloodthirsty savages anytime soon, and the entire planet would smell a whole lot better of lavender soap and roasted mutton once they were scrubbed off the map. Now, all I really had to do was wait around for some wild-eyed red priest to stagger out of the shadows, stare into my amethyst eyes, and declare me to be the legendary reincarnation of Azor Ahai reborn. Wait, actually, it would be infinitely better if it was a sultry red priestess instead, just so I could score some free exotic pussy along with my divine destiny. On second thought, perhaps that was a catastrophic error, because while those fire-worshipping hags looked smoking hot on the outside thanks to their glamorous ruby chokers, they were ancient, rotting hags underneath the optical illusions. I shuddered violently just thinking about the horrifying biological reality of getting intimate with a 1,000-year-old corpse witch. That bizarre train of thought brought me crashing back to the impending apocalypse presented by the White Walkers. All in all, I did not particularly give a single flying fuck about the ice zombies marching down from the frozen north. Sure, they were theoretically a massive, civilization-ending problem, but it would not matter one bit until at least 300 years into the future. So, for the remainder of my childhood, I intended to thoroughly enjoy the bountiful summers, gorge myself on roasted meats, and leave those frozen bastards for my great-great-great-grandchildren to deal with instead. Would my descendants even be around by then, or would House Targaryen manage to implode, burn down, and die out long before the long night ever arrived because of my meddling? 300 years of reigning supreme over a continent of illiterate peasants was not a terrible run by historical standards, but it was absolutely pathetic when you took into cold, hard consideration the fact that we possessed living, breathing, city-roasting tactical nuclear weapons. That is essentially the cosmic equivalent of handing nuclear launch codes to an inbred medieval king and telling him to have fun ruling the world. Not only that, but what made the situation infinitely worse was the absolute genetic monopoly preventing anyone outside the royal bloodline from ever riding or bonding with those winged weapons. The more you pondered the geopolitical mechanics of dragons, the more you felt an overwhelming urge to cuss out every single idiot who contributed to the eventual extinction of the beasts. While I would love to simply blame Georgie for killing them off because he lacked the tactical imagination to write around them, it did not matter anymore because I was physically trapped inside his brutal literary sandbox, and the death of the dragons was hurtling toward us on a freight train of stupidity. While the famous myth of Targaryen madness was wildly exaggerated by biased Citadel maesters who probably rubbed one out every time a dragon died of a bellyache, I could not help wondering sometimes if there was some truth to the genetic roulette. In moments of deep philosophical despair, you really begin to wonder whether it would be infinitely safer to just march down into Flea Bottom, pluck some random, scrappy street urchin out of the mud, and crown him king instead. Of course, that was a profoundly retarded idea that would instantly collapse the entire feudal social contract, though the Roman and Byzantine empires had managed to utilize adoption as a functional succession model quite successfully. Even then, that brilliant system immediately broke the moment Marcus Aurelius fathered a real biological son named Commodus, who turned out to be a murderous, arena-obsessed lunatic. A sharp, persistent knock on my heavy oak bedchamber door violently shattered my deep historical musings. Pushing myself up from the feather mattress, I padded across the cold stone floor and pulled the wooden barrier open to find a terrified royal servant bowing low, his nose practically touching the flags. The trembling man stuttered out a formal announcement that my mother was currently waiting for me and her solar to break our fast together. Staring at the poor bastard for a solemn moment, I gave him a curt nod, dismissed him with a casual flick of a copper penny that he scrambled to catch, and closed the door behind me before stepping out into the drafty corridor. Adopting heirs was never a viable strategy for most hereditary monarchies anyway, seeing as 9 times out of 10 they desperately relied on the superstitious fairy tale of divine, God-blessed bloodlines to trick the peasant masses into believing they were born to be ruled. Someone shattering that fragile illusion was the absolute last thing the nobility wanted, and it was certainly not something I wanted either since I was currently sitting near the top of the food chain. Either way, what truly mattered in the grand Game of Thrones was the boring, day-to-day administrative reality of training your royal children from a tender age and simply bothering to be a decent, present father. At least half the catastrophic civil wars in human history could have been entirely avoided if powerful men had just spent quality time raising their kids instead of hunting boars and siring bastards in every tavern. That only applied, of course, if you managed to survive your turbulent tenure as an absolute monarch without getting your throat slit by your own bodyguards. I am definitely not side-eyeing the historical Praetorian Guard. Those treacherous bastards could certainly learn a thing or two about professional loyalty from the Varangian Guards. Ultimately, the absolute best way to gracefully conclude your reign as a lord or king was to simply abdicate, pack your bags, and step aside before someone else forced you off the mortal coil at knife point. Taking up peaceful, low-stress hobbies like farming, or better yet, retiring to the coast to cultivate massive, prize-winning cabbages, was the ultimate power move. Diocletian would surely nod in solemn agreement from the afterlife while tending to his root vegetables. Finally reaching the oak doors of the solar, I pushed them open and stepped into the warm, torchlit chamber. As was her customary routine, my mother was already seated at the head of the heavy mahogany table, waiting patiently for her favorite little sociopath to arrive so we could break our fast. How sweet of her, truly. Not wasting another precious second on pleasantries, I eagerly dug into the mountain of food waiting on the silver platters as I walked over and pulled out my chair to sit right beside her. The morning spread laid out across the long table was a magnificent, gluttonous monument to feudal privilege and agricultural exploitation. In the center sat an enormous, golden-brown roast capon, its crispy skin glistening under the amber candlelight, dripping with rich honey and tart lemon juice that pooled in the ceramic dish below. Right beside the poultry rested a massive honey-glazed ham, studded with whole cloves and oozing with spiced, savory pork juices that smelled strongly of cloves, brown sugar, and wood smoke. A towering loaf of dark, crusty brown bread sat sliced on a wooden board, practically begging to be slathered with thick layers of sweet yellow butter churned fresh from mountain cream. There were bowls of sharp, aged goat cheese that smelled like a wet barnyard in the best possible way, alongside roasted root vegetables glistening in rich mutton fat and caramelized to perfection. A silver jug of spiced morning ale sat next to a pitcher of fresh cow milk, while a platter of warm plum tarts dusted with powdered sugar occupied the far end of the table like a sweet, sugary promise of dental ruin. I shoveled massive chunks of roasted capon and buttered bread into my mouth with zero regard for royal table manners, chewing noisily because being a 5-year-old prince meant you could get away with eating like a feral badger and nobody dared correct you. Visenya turned her head slightly, her striking violet eyes watching my chaotic dietary assault with a mixture of maternal amusement and mild disapproval. Resting her pale cheek against her knuckles, she broke the silence while I was halfway through swallowing a massive bite of honeyed ham. That secret underworld parchment that you managed to acquire and hand over to me the other day, Maegor, Visenya began smoothly, her voice carrying that authority that made grown lords piss their silk trousers. Tell me truthfully, how on earth did you manage to get your hands on it? I paused chewing, swallowing hard and hastily taking a generous gulp of the warm cow milk to wash down the feast before flashing her an innocent, gap-toothed smile. Oh, it was just a little local extracurricular project that I wanted to test out using some of the sharper street urchins down in the city gutters, I replied casually, giving a vague wave of my greasy hand to portray the absolute simplicity of running an espionage network. Turns out those kids are surprisingly competent at snooping around when you dangle a few copper coins in front of their dirty faces. With her sharp, unnerving purple gaze boring straight down into my soul, a slow, appreciative smile curved the corners of her lips. Most of the petty crimes and tavern gossip listed on that paper, I already knew, Visenya admitted softly, reaching across the mahogany table to gently brush a stray crumb from my forehead with long, slender fingers. But it is still remarkably impressive work, Maegor, especially for a child of your tender years. She pulled her hand back, resting it against the edge of her plate. The specific details regarding the massive corruption ring operating out of the royal harbor, however, that piece of intelligence was entirely new to my desk. Rest assured, that greedy harbor master and crooked customs officials will be quietly dealt with before the week is out, and all because of your little enterprise. Offering her a warm, winning smile, I leaned back comfortably into my oversized carved chair, patting my distended stomach with profound satisfaction. Happy to be of service to the crown, mother, I replied smoothly, before shifting gears. What about you, though? Have things been going smoothly in the royal court, or is it just the usual parade of sniveling lords whining about taxes and border disputes? Visenya let out a long, deeply resigned sigh, momentarily closing her eyes against the sheer mental exhaustion of medieval governance. It is merely the endless, grinding trivialities of the court, nothing truly worthy of your attention, she murmured, opening her eyes again. However, I do happen to have some rather significant news that should brighten your mood. We will be packing up our belongings and heading back home to Dragonstone in a few months. She paused to take a sip of her spiced wine. Your father has finally decided to bring his lengthy royal progress to a close much earlier than initially planned. Damn, we were leaving the Red Keep behind just as I was starting to get properly attached to the chaotic energy of the capital. Oh well, there was still a lot more that I needed to do in Dragonstone as well. Chapter 20. Orys Baratheon leaned back against the carved oak of his high-backed chair, his heavy gaze drifting downward from the shaded royal pavilion toward the sun-drenched expanse of the tourney field below. The great tourney was in full spring, the stands packed with shouting lords, rustling silks, and sun-blinded commoners whose roars of approval washed over the wooden railings like the tide hitting the cliffs of Storm's End. Today would be the final day of the nightly jousts, the clash where legends would be forged for years to come. Taking the silver chalice of dark arbor wine offered to him by a nervous young servant, Orys raised the vessel to his lips and took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the tart plum flavor upon his tongue before lowering the cup again. After so many long decades of blood, mud, and bone-breaking struggles across a continent at war, it felt almost strange that he could finally sit in peace and relax for a moment. It had been 2 full decades since his brother Aegon had been crowned king, and the realm had been climbing steadily uphill ever since, growing fatter and richer under the dragon's wide shadow. Who in their right mind would have ever thought that a low-born bastard of Dragonstone could accomplish so much in one lifetime? No one would have believed it back then, yet he had done it anyway. Who in the 7 hells is that down there? King Aegon's sharp voice broke through Orys's reverie. The conqueror leaned forward in his high seat, pointing a thick, calloused finger out toward the far end of the lists, his dark brows furrowing in deep, suspicious thought. Orys immediately traced his gaze along the line of the king's extended finger, searching the dust for the rider in question. The man was mounted upon a monster of a midnight black warhorse, the beast's dark coat glistening with sweat in the afternoon heat. The rider himself was clad head to heel in heavy plate armor of a matching shade, utterly void of polished brass, silver inlay, or painted crests. It was plain steel, yet it was clearly not cheap munition armor scraped together from some village blacksmith's scrap heap. It had been shaped by the hands of a true master armor smith, every joint fitting with fluid, seamless perfection. In his right hand, the rider held a heavy tourney lance resting against his pauldron, while his left arm buckled a blank shield that bore no sigil, no colors, and no proud house motto. A mystery knight, your grace, Orys mused aloud, swirling the dark red wine around the rim of his chalice. The king hummed softly to himself, rubbing his stubbled chin in contemplation. I have been watching him since the first round, but it is still a shock to me that he has managed to push his way this far into the lists. Aegon narrowed his violet eyes, leaning closer to the balcony rail. Could it be some famous hedge knight playing at games, or perhaps a lord's son riding under a false guise? Mystery knights were a copper a dozen in grand spectacles like this one. Every foolish young man who had ever picked up a wooden sword harbored grand, romantic dreams of forging his own legendary tale. They dreamed of storming through the lists through sheer unadulterated luck, unhorsing every seasoned champion in the realm, and having sweet-voiced bards sing songs of their mysterious glory for 100 years to come. Yet, the brutal reality of the joust rarely cared for fairy tales. Hardly 1 in 20 ever made it past the initial bouts, and the rare few who survived the first hour usually ended up coughing blood into the dirt long before the quarterfinals. Orys could not recall ever seeing a true mystery knight actually win a major tourney in his entire life. Yet this silent, shadow-clad figure had somehow managed to accomplish the near impossible. If he could somehow manage to unhorse his final opponents today, the unknown rider would instantly enter the realm of living legend. Orys fingered the heavy gold rings on his thick hand, his eyes sharpening as he studied the rider's posture in the saddle. Though the knight was undeniably broad across the chest and shoulders, there was a certain restless, agile fluidness to his movements that suggested a youth of no more than 6 and 10 years of age. He was remarkably young to be breaking lances against seasoned killers. Who in the 7 heavens could the boy be? Orys let his eyes dart around the shaded benches of the royal box, scrutinizing the familiar faces around him with a sharp, critical eye. His nephew, Crown Prince Aenys, was sitting just to the king's right, leaning over to chat amiably with a young lady whose face was obscured by the bright Targaryen banners fluttering overhead. On Orys's own left sat his own son, Davos, leaning over the wooden railing with an eager grin plastered across his face. Davos had been knighted just a year prior and had insisted on entering the lists himself. The boy had put up a ferocious fight, reaching a respectable ranking in the middle brackets before a heavy blow from a reachman's lance had sent him tumbling into the soft dirt. Humming quietly to himself, Orys suddenly realized that his other nephew, Prince Maegor, was nowhere to be seen among the royal party. He did not pay the absence much mind. The younger prince had a notorious habit of vanishing into thin air for hours at a time, only to reappear whenever it suited his whims. Maegor was a cordial enough boy when approached, polite to a fault, undeniably clever, and possessed of a frighteningly sharp tongue, yet Orys had always harbored a faint, quiet inkling of deep-seated unease regarding the child. Perhaps it was the unsettling manner in which Maegor suspiciously cultivated close, intimate friendships with almost every major heir and high-born squire in the 7 kingdoms. The lords, sons all seemed to admire and follow him for reasons Orys could not quite fathom. Even young Davos, despite every stern warning Orys had given him about royal court politics, had fallen completely under Maegor's strange, magnetic charm. There was simply something hidden deep in Maegor's dark eyes that made Orys inherently distrustful of the boy. He had the sharp, cold gaze of someone who was far too smart, far too ambitious, and far too dangerous for his own good. Such relentless ambition would not necessarily be a terrible trait if he were born to a lesser noble house, but when your elder brother was as gentle, frail, and soft-spoken as Aenys, well, quiet whispers were already circulating through the corners of the keep about whether the crown prince could actually hold the realm together with an iron grip when Aegon eventually passed. In a strange, uncomfortable way, Maegor reminded Orys of his own younger self. While Orys would have never dared lift a finger against his royal brother, he knew the dark, hungry pull of ambition all too well. Had Aegon not launched his grand conquest and elevated Orys to a lord paramount, Orys knew that sooner or later his own restless ambition would have driven him to cross the narrow sea to sell his sword, forge his own mercenary company, and carve his name into history with blood and iron. Of course, he would never dare admit such treasonous thoughts aloud to a living soul, much less to himself in the cold light of day. Some dark truths were far better left buried in the shadowy corners of the mind. A sudden wave of thunderous shouting from the crowd dragged Orys straight out of his brooding thoughts. Down on the sandy track, the mystery knight pulled sharply on his reins, wheeling his midnight destrier around to take his position at the far end of the tilt barrier. From the opposite entrance, another knight trotted out onto the field to a chorus of deafening cheers. The Grand Herald raised his trumpet and shouted the contender's name across the arena, Esser Burton Krakau. The massive Westerman laughed boisterously from beneath his silver-plated helm, swinging his heavy oak lance loosely at his side as his towering charger trotted forward with graceful, heavy steps. It was a miracle that the poor horse could even support the sheer, ungodly mass of the man riding it. Esser Burton was easily the largest, most terrifying brute of a human being Orys had seen in the entire tourney, a colossal, hulking boar of a knight who had already brutalized half his opponents and left 2 of them being carried off the field on wooden stretchers. Compared to the boisterous, energetic bravado of the Krakau giant, the mystery knight stood completely motionless at the far end of the lists. Mounted atop his sleek black horse, his lance was held rigidly upright at his side, his posture loose yet completely devoid of tension. Beneath the shadows of his steel visor, the Black Knight simply stared down the track at the laughing giant, refusing to budge a single inch or acknowledge the crowd's roar. For the first time in a very long while, Orys felt a jolt of electric excitement tighten in his chest. From what he had observed of the Mystery Knight's previous matches, the unknown rider did not rely on brute strength or a single repetitive tactical formula. Instead, he fluidly adapted his entire riding style to exploit the specific weaknesses of whoever sat across from him. Even now, Oris could not help but wonder how in the seven hells the kid planned on overcoming a walking mountain like Burden Krakau. Judging by the sudden hush that washed over the pavilion, Oris was certainly not the only one anticipating the bloodbath. The chatter in the royal box died down completely as the king and the lords along with everyone else leaned over the railings to watch the impending violence. Esser Burden trotted his massive mount up to the central divider, tossing his head back and lifting his visor to shout aloud, vulgar taunt across the dirt at his silent opponent, laughing so hard his heavy belly shook beneath his steel breastplate. In an eerie, deeply unnerving display of discipline, neither the Black Knight nor his warhorse twitched so much as a muscle in response. They remained as cold and unreadable as carved granite. Growing visibly frustrated when he realized his taunts were falling on deaf ears, the Krakau Knight let out a grunt of annoyance, slammed his visor shut, and waved his heavy gauntlet at the master of the tourney, demanding that the herald signal the start of the bout. The herald blew his bronze horn, the sound piercing the afternoon heat, and the match began. The first second passed in a blur of motion as the Mystery Knight exploded into action. His sleek black destrier dug its hooves deep into the dirt, accelerating down the lists with astounding speed, charging straight toward the giant without a single fraction of hesitation. Burden Krakau thundered forward from the opposite side, his massive charger tearing up clods of earth as he lowered his heavy lance and pulled his thick shield tight against his ribs. Burden was not aiming for the center of his opponent's shield, he had angled his iron tip directly at the Mystery Knight's visor. Oris furrowed his heavy brows in sudden anger, realizing the dirty trick. A devastating blow like that, delivered with the full kinetic force of a hulking giant like Burden, would easily shatter a man's neck or punch clean through his faceplate, killing him on the spot. Unlike most green squires or timid knights, who would have panicked at the sight of an iron point rushing toward their eyes and tried to clumsily check their horse at the last microsecond, the Mystery Knight did neither. Instead, he aggressively lowered his center of gravity, leaning his body far forward over his horse's neck as if he were born in the saddle. The deafening thunder of galloping hooves violently hammered against the dirt as the two warhorses closed the distance until there was no space left to maneuver. Burden's heavy iron tip rushed straight for the black visor, and just when it appeared the weapon would impact and tear the Mystery Knight's head clean off his shoulders, the rider executed a terrifyingly precise tilt of his neck. He shifted his head just half an inch to the side at the exact millisecond of contact, causing Burden's iron tip to slide off the sloped steel cheek of his helm with an ear-splitting, metallic screech that set every tooth in Oris's mouth on edge. Before Burden could even register that his lethal blow had missed, the Mystery Knight struck back with precision. Adjusting his grip on his own lance in a flash, he drove his oak shaft forward, driving the blunt tip directly into the high seam of Esser Burden's left shoulder pauldron. A thunderous thwack echoed across the entire tourney ground like a catapult firing a boulder. The Mystery Knight's lance shattered into 100 flying splinters, and the sheer force of the impact lifted the giant Krakau cleanly out of his high saddle. Burden flew backward through the air like a sack of grain, crashing violently onto the hard-packed dirt with a deafening rattle of steel plates that shook the ground. The crowd erupted into an absolute frenzy of screaming and cheered wildly. Oris let out a long breath he had not even realized he was holding, slowly leaning back into his wooden chair once more. He stared down at the black-armored rider, who was calmly trotting his horse in a slow circle while waving a polite gauntlet at the roaring crowd. As the knight turned, Oris's sharp eyes caught a strange detail about his gear. The Mystery Knight's saddle was built rather oddly compared to standard Westerosi leatherwork. It featured a significantly higher cantle and modified stirrup angles designed to lock the rider's lower body into place, offering unprecedented leverage during an impact. Yet the design was subtle enough that a commoner would never notice it. Oris did not have time to ponder the strange engineering, however, as the bruised and battered Krakau giant was dragged off the field by his sweating squires, his head hanging low in absolute humiliation. The trumpet sounded once more, announcing the final challenger of the day. Esser Robin Darklin of the Kingsguard, having already won his previous brackets with flawless grace, rode out onto the lists to face the unknown champion. The white cloak was a magnificent picture of knightly perfection, his polished silver armor gleaming in the sun, his pristine white cloak billowing behind him like a cloud. Yet Esser Robin did not immediately lower his lance or demand the start of the final bout. In a display of chivalry, the Kingsguard knight reined in his charger, raised his visor, and declared to the Grand Herald that he would wait as long as necessary for his opponent to rest his mount and catch his breath before they broke lances. Oris nodded in respect from the royal box. It was good to see that true chivalry was not yet dead in the realm. Aegon had chosen the men of his Kingsguard exceptionally well. After a long pause, the Black Knight raised his lance in a crisp salute, signaling to the herald that he was ready. The trumpet blared, and the final clash commenced. The first pass was a display of pure, terrifying speed and relentless discipline from both men. The destroyers thundered down the track, their hooves striking the earth in perfect synchronization. Both riders held their weapons flawlessly, and as they crossed the center line, both lances shattered simultaneously flush against the centers of their opponents, shields with a roar like thunder. Wood exploded into a cloud of splinters. Neither man swerved, nor did either rider lose his seat by so much as an inch. As Sir Robin wheeled his horse around at the far end of the lists, Orys noticed a subtle flicker of shock across the white cloak's exposed face. The heralds handed both men fresh lances, and the second pass began immediately. Seeking to end the contest through superior reach, Sir Robin changed his approach, angling his lance high toward the Black Knight's helm. But the Mystery Knight anticipated the move entirely. As the horses closed in, the Black Rider dropped low over his horse's neck in a startling posture, letting Robin's lance point slice harmlessly through empty air above his right ear. Simultaneously, the Mystery Knight extended his own arm with lethal precision, driving his lance tip directly into the small, exposed joint of Sir Robin's right elbow plate. The heavy wooden tip struck the precise nerve center, shattering the lance and instantly deadening the white cloak's right arm. Sir Robin let out a sharp grunt of pain as his arm went limp, his own shattered lance clattering uselessly into the dirt. The crowd gasped in disbelief as Sir Robin fought to retain his grip on the reins with his left hand, barely managing to wheel his horse around for the third and final pass. The Mystery Knight accepted a third lance from his squire without a word, his movements as calm and methodical. On the third pass, the Mystery Knight moved in for the kill. He did not aim for the head, nor did he target the center of the white cloak's dented shield. Instead, as the horses thundered past one another at breakneck speed, the Black Rider targeted the exact, vulnerable seam where Sir Robin's wooden shield was buckled to his steel breastplate harness. The impact was absolute perfection. With a violent, explosive splintering of oak, the Mystery Knight's lance hit the seam like a heavy siege engine. The tremendous mechanical force tore the shield harness clean off the Kingsguard's armor and lifted Sir Robin straight out of his stirrups. The white cloak flipped backward through the air, his pristine white mantle swirling around him before he crashed heavily onto the turf on his back. Silence fell over the entire arena for one shocking second, followed by an explosion of sheer, unadulterated noise from tens of thousands of cheering spectators. Sir Robin Darkland lay in the dirt for a moment, catching his breath before slowly pushing himself up onto his knees. Rejecting the rushed assistance of his squires, the bruised Kingsguard stood up on his own 2 feet, retrieved his fallen helm, and offered his victorious opponent a deep, gracious bow of total respect. The grand tourney was over. The Mystery Knight had won. Trotting his sweaty midnight horse down the center of the lists, the silent champion approached the front of the grand royal pavilion. He dismounted with fluid, practiced grace, dropped to one knee in the soft dirt, and bowed his head low before King Aegon. The conqueror stood up from his throne, a rare, massive grin stretching across his weathered face as he looked down at the unknown warrior. "You have given this realm a spectacle it will not soon forget, brave Esser." Aegon's booming voice echoed across the quieted stands. "Unhelm yourself at once, show your face to the lords and ladies of Westeros so that we may bestow upon you the champion's crown and the gold you have so brilliantly earned." The Mystery Knight remained kneeling in the dust, his dark head bowed. He did not immediately reach for his visor. Instead, a clear, surprisingly youthful voice echoed out from beneath the steel faceplate, ringing sharply through the quiet pavilion. "I seek no gold or flower wreaths from your hand, my liege," the knight stated calmly. "If it pleases your grace, I ask only one reward for my victory today. I request to be officially knighted by the hand of the king himself." A wave of loud, astonished gasps rippled through the royal box. Orys narrowed his eyes, staring at his brother in thought. Despite the voice being distorted due to the helm, he was fairly certain that he had heard it before. Lords squirmed in their seats, and even Aegon raised his brows in surprise, though it seemed he hadn't realized whose voice it was. A Mystery Knight who had just dismantled the greatest champions and Kingsguard in the entire realm was not even a knight at all. King Aegon let out a laugh that shook his broad chest, before shaking his head with a wry smile. "By the seven, a squire." The king drew his legendary Valyrian steel blade, Blackfire, from its scabbard, the dark, rippling steel catching the sunlight like a burning ember. "You have earned it thrice over, boy. Spoken like a true warrior." Aegon stepped down to the edge of the low balcony, resting the flat side of the dark Valyrian blade gently upon the Mystery Rider's left shoulder, then his right. "In the name of the Father, I charge you to be just," Aegon proclaimed in his grand, kingly voice. "In the name of the Mother, I charge you to protect the young and innocent. In the name of the warrior, I charge you to be brave. Arise, Esser Knight." Aegon sheathed his dark sword with a sharp metallic click. "Now, cut the dramatic theatrics, unhelm yourself, and let the realm see the face of its newest champion." The crowd leaned forward as one, holding its collective breath. Down in the dirt, the newly dubbed knight slowly reached up with his gauntleted hands. He unclasped the heavy iron gorget, loosened the leather neck straps, and smoothly lifted the heavy black helm off his head, shaking out his hair as the bright afternoon sun finally hit his exposed face. Chapter 21. You are a knight of the realm now. The sharp, melodious voice echoed from my right, reverberating softly off the wet, steaming stone walls of the royal bath chamber, though I did not bother to turn my head just yet. Instead, I slid deeper into the sunken marble basin, resting the back of my aching neck against the smooth, heated rim of the tub. I let out a long, shuddering sigh of absolute, unadulterated bliss as the fragrant, boiling water soaked straight into my bruised muscles and tired bones. Ah, sweet mother of God, life was magnificent. This was precisely the kind of divine, luxurious physical therapy a weary warrior required to brighten up a long, exhausting afternoon. As it turned out, beating up medieval knights, cracking their heavy wooden lances into a million flying splinters, and violently slamming big men into the dirt was the ultimate balm for the human soul. Everyone in the world should try their hands on a hobby as relieving as beating people up. No wonder original Maegor loved to murder people all the time. I suppose I am a proper knight now, aren't I? I answered lazily, finally rolling my head across the marble lip to watch my mother slipping beneath the rippling, mirrored surface of the deep water. A knight of the 7 kingdoms before my facial hair had even fully filled in. Who in the hell would have ever predicted that when I first opened my eyes in this world? If you really thought about it, I was practically living inside a Disney fantasy film. I possessed an magical affinity for animals, I was disgustingly handsome, and now I had been dubbed a heroic knight by the king himself. All I needed to complete the fairy tale checklist was to go rescue some helpless, high-born princess locked away in a tall stone tower and decapitate a fire-breathing dragon. Wait a minute, wasn't that very similar to Prince Charming from the Shrek movies? I even had my own terrifying fairy godmother in the form of Visenya Targaryen. But of course, the best method for dealing with something was to simply look the other way and forget about the whole ordeal. You are the youngest person ever to be dubbed a knight, and I must admit I am proud of you, Visenya said smoothly. Her bright, luminous amethyst eyes glowed like burning jewels in the ambient torchlight as she waded through the chest-deep water toward my end of the basin. Her heavy, silver-gold hair was soaked through, clinging to her ivory shoulders and back in sleek, shimmering, metallic strands. The youngest person ever knighted in history, I mused aloud, shifting beneath the warm waves and rubbing my chin in thought. I highly doubt anyone is going to be breaking my record anytime soon. In the original book continuity written by George, the youngest person to ever earn his golden spurs was Demon Blackfire, who got knighted at the ripe old age of 12 after tearing through a squire's tourney. That bastard was annoyingly perfect at every physical martial skill he touched. He was basically written like a power fantasy self-insert created by a 15-year-old, which might have been a great gig had he not ended up riddled with arrows on the redgrass field at the end of his rebellion. Aside from Demon, Jaime Lannister held a famous record by getting dubbed at 15 by Sir Arthur Dayne, along with a tiny handful of other legendary historical figures scattered across the centuries, but all of them were noticeably older than me when they received the honor. My record was secure, enshrined in the Citadel's dusty ledgers until the end of days. Visenya glided silently through the water until she was standing dangerously close, invading my personal space with the unhurried confidence of an apex predator. She reached out with a dripping, slender arm and rested her palm directly against the center of my chest, feeling the steady thrum of my heartbeat. Looking straight into my eyes, her sharp, pale face softened into a rare, breathtaking smile that could have launched 1,000 warships as she leaned close. No one else in this entire realm can compare themselves to you, my son. No one. She pulled her hand back, shifting fluidly beneath the surface of the bath. The water lapped against the carved stone edges of the basin as she placed her hands upon the flat rim of the tub, lifting her body out of the water with a single, remarkably graceful turn of her long, toned legs. Come here, she commanded softly, resting her weight against the smooth marble ledge. Apply the soap to my back. Lying flat on her stomach along the warm stone bench, resting her cheek against her folded arms, Mother idly kicked a heavy bar of expensive, perfumed soap toward me with the heel of her foot. I reached out and caught the slippery brick of soap between my palms right before it could slide back down into the depths of the tub, holding it up to the candlelight to inspect it with a critical eye. The bar was clearly a luxury item imported straight from the free cities of Essos, far removed from the harsh, skin-peeling lye soap crafted from boiled pig fat that the local Westerosi commoners used to scrub their laundry. This stuff was crafted from cold-pressed olive oils, sweet almond extracts, and infused with heavy, exotic scents of myrrh and crushed cinnamon wood. How tragic, I thought to myself with a sigh. When I was first reincarnated into this gritty medieval fantasy universe, I had fully expected to be plunged into a filthy, mud-caked, historical cesspool where every single person, including royalty, smelled like rotten cabbage and unwashed socks. I thought I would be living like a dirty pig in a drafty barn. Yet here I was, surrounded by scented SOC oils and all the rich expensive stuff. It turned out that the ultraric ruling class of high Valyrian blood enjoyed taking luxurious, fragrant baths every single day. My disappointment was truly immeasurable, and my day was completely ruined. This was not the medieval experience I was promised. Climbing out of the deep stone tub, water cascading off my shoulders in sheets, I gripped the bar of scented soap tightly between my fingers to ensure the slippery devil didn't escape my grasp. Of course, I had mostly been joking with my internal complaints. I thoroughly enjoyed taking hot baths, especially when you had beauties scrubbing your skin raw until you glistened like a polished statue. Believe me, once someone has experienced the absolute pinnacle of ancient feudal luxury, he would never voluntarily choose to take a cold shower ever again. If I have accomplished anything great, it is only due to your relentless instruction, I suppose, I replied finally, a small smirk touching the corners of my mouth. It was mostly the truth. Because most of my time was spent in Dragonstone, where she was the one training me in everything. Sitting down on the marble bench right near the back of her knees, I looked down at the stunning visual expanse stretched out before me. Her pale skin was as smooth, flawless, and brilliantly white as polished ivory, glowing softly under the amber light of the oil lamps. Her slender, narrow waist dipped down sharply before flaring out into the magnificent, sweeping curves of her hips and the firm, pillowy mass of her backside. Her flesh was remarkably tight, sculpted by years of riding dragonback through high-altitude winds, yet full and supple to the eye. Her long, shapely legs were pressed tightly together, preventing me from catching anything more than a fleeting glance at her lower frame, though the sheer aesthetic perfection of her silhouette was enough to make any mortal man lose his train of thought. Rubbing the perfumed bar vigorously between my wet palms, I built up a thick, creamy lather before dipping my hands into a wooden bucket of boiling water to soften the foam. I brought my hands down onto the back of her neck and long, muscular shoulders, my fingers sinking into her tense muscles. A low, sweet sigh of relief escaped Visonya's parted lips as I began my work, my thumbs pressing deep into the soft tissues to coax away the build-up tension from her training sessions. My fingers worked masterfully across her shoulder blades, kneading the tight knots before I lathered the soap once more and slid my palms down the long, breathtaking curve of her spine. "You're saddled during the final joust," Visonya managed to ask, her breath hitching slightly as my palms pressed firm circles against her middle back. It looked distinctly different from standard knightly tack. "Why?" I hummed a quiet, noncommittal note in reply, my hands gliding downward to play along the smooth skin and small, delicate dimples located right above the curve of her waist. I could feel her body subconsciously press itself down against the warm stone bench under the firm pressure of my movements. "It is a custom design featuring a significantly higher cantle and angled stirrup mountings to give me maximum leverage," I explained smoothly. "While I am huge and broad for my age, it still would have not been as easy for me to unhorse grown men who weigh twice as much as me without the structural support of that modified frame. When giant, fat bastards like Esser Burton Krakow, who probably spent his spare time stealing food from defenseless peasant children and laughing in their faces, were charging down the lists at full speed, a smart fighter needed to utilize every available structural advantage to even the playing field. It wasn't technical cheating by any standard rules of the tourney, seeing as I still had to rely on my own reflexes and accuracy 9 times out of 10, but it gave me a fighting chance against true physical freaks of nature. Perhaps I was being a bit too harsh on the Krakow giant. The man wasn't actually fat in the traditional sense, he was more like a massive, big-boned lumberjack constructed out of raw muscle, but his sheer size made him a terrifying opponent. Genetics in this fantasy world were a mystery anyway. In what logical universe was a starveling street urchin like Dunk the Lunk able to grow well past 6 feet 7 inches tall without receiving a single gram of proper nutritional protein throughout his entire childhood? Shaking my head free of the lingering thoughts, I watched as my soapy hands slid even lower down her back, smoothly rising up to cup the full, heavy curves of her backside. The pale flesh was amazingly soft and warm against my fingertips, and I gave the firm mass a gentle, appreciative squish, watching the pillowy weight yield effortlessly under the palm pressure. As I lathered a bit more scented soap across my fingers, I paused for a brief moment, contemplating. The grand tourney had been officially thrown to celebrate the second decade of my father's reign over the 7 kingdoms, bringing together every major lord, proud knight, and ambitious heir straight into the heart of King's Landing. My primary objective for the week had been simple: carve my name deep into the history books, establish a reputation, and build political clout among the younger generation, all of which I had accomplished for the most part. Jousting was a good sport because it allowed me to utilize a few clever tricks and tight discipline to sway luck in my favor, but I had zero intention of participating in the brutal, chaotic, floor-level melee scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. While I possessed confidence in my sword arms, I was not a mindless, suicidal chicken who was going to willingly charge into a mass riot of bloodthirsty war veterans just to get my skull caved in by a stray Morningstar from behind. Baylor would surely know a thing or two about that. Massaging the warm, yielding flesh trapped between my fingers, a wild, unhinged thought drifted through my brain: it would be an experience to just dive face-first into the softness right then and there. Unfortunately, my fully modern frontal lobe was far too functional to allow me to attempt something like that. Instead, I contented myself with squeezing and lifting the heavy curves until the soap was thoroughly worked into her skin. Once I felt I had done a thorough job, I leaned back on my knees, giving her smooth backside one final, firm pat before standing up to stretch my stiff joints. Visenya remained lying flat on the bench for a lingering moment, letting out a soft sigh before smoothly rolling over onto her back. She did not bother to cover herself in the slightest, her dark amethyst eyes remaining closed as she bared her entire front side to the open air without an ounce of shame or modesty. "It is of importance for a prince to thoroughly understand the body and minds of women," she stated in a low voice, her eyes shut against the glowing torchlight. "In the years to come, countless high-born maidens, ambitious ladies, and beautiful foreign courtesans will attempt to seduce you solely to manipulate your power for their own family's benefit. You must be fully prepared for their traps and learn to keep your mind clear and cold in such moments." I offered an easy, unbothered shrug at her stern lecture. While her harsh, practical political wisdom made complete sense in a brutal court, dying by SNU at the hands of an gorgeous assassin didn't sound like the worst way for a man to go out. That was only if I were an old, decrepit man looking for an exciting exit, however. For the time being, I had zero interest in dying by any method, no matter how breathtaking or deadly the assassin happened to be. Picking up the block of SOC soap once more, I accepted her implicit invitation and sat back down beside her. While her methods of instruction were extreme, who in their right mind was going to turn down this opportunity? Looking down at her as I lathered the soap between my hands once again, I took a moment to truly appreciate the absolute peak of Valyrian genetics resting before me. Visenya Targaryen was the literal definition of ethereal, otherworldly beauty. Her face looked as though it had been meticulously sculpted out of pristine white marble by a master artist, featuring high, sharp cheekbones, a straight, delicate nose, and remarkably full, soft pink lips that stood out brilliantly against her pale skin. Staring down at those lush lips, I could not help wondering for a second what it would actually feel like to press my own mouth against them. Suppressing a quiet sigh, I brought my soapy hands down to her slender neck, gently massaging the delicate column of skin while her long, metallic silver hair spilled out across the bench in wet, glistening waves. Raising my right hand, I reached forward out of pure, fascinating curiosity and gently cupped her cheek, feeling the unbelievably soft, warm skin beneath my thumb. I pressed lightly against her high cheekbone, watching her flesh squish slightly beneath my touch before pulling my hand back. Resting upon her chest were two perfectly shaped, wonderfully proportioned breasts that sat firm and high against her ribs, completely unbothered by gravity. They were neither excessively large nor too small, boasting the ideal, natural teardrop contour that high-born ladies prayed to the maiden for. Crowning each breast were deep pink nipples that glistened brightly under the thin sheen of bathwater, framed by neat, circular areolas. Humming a low tune, I slid my hands down her neck and pressed my lathered palms flat against her sternum, sliding them right down the valley between her breasts before spreading my fingers outward to fully cup both mounds. The flesh was amazingly squishy and warm, yielding effortlessly under my touch. I could not resist the overwhelming urge to give both mounds a firm, rhythmic squeeze, watching her flat, muscular abdomen instantly contort and tighten as she took a sharp, sudden breath. Slowly and steadily, her pink nipples hardened into tight, rigid peaks under the continuous, circular movements of my lathered palms. I could feel the stiffened nubs poking firmly against the center of my fingers as my hands moved in slow, massaging patterns across her chest. Reaching out with my thumb and forefinger, I pinched one of the hardened nipples lightly between my fingers, squeezing the tiny peak just enough to watch Visenya let out an involuntary, sharp gasp, her full lips parting as her chest heaved. Seeing that she offered no vocal objection or reprimand, I trapped both stiff peaks between my knuckles and gently rolled the hardened nipples in small, deliberate circles under the pretense of thoroughly washing her chest. Every single time my fingertips brushed lightly over the sensitive tips, the woman twitched slightly against the marble, her breathing growing noticeably heavier. Eventually, once I was satisfied that her upper torso was thoroughly cleansed, I abandoned her chest and slid my hands further down her front to scrub her flat stomach. My fingers traced the defined, subtle outline of her abdominal muscles, feeling the hard wall of core strength hidden beneath her soft, pale skin. My palms roamed along the narrow, sweeping length of her waist before my gaze drifted lower still. Nestled deep between the tight junction of her long, toned thighs lay the final, hidden crown jewel of her form, though I could not see much of anything due to how tightly she kept her legs crossed together. Unfortunately for my lingering curiosity, before I could attempt to maneuver my hands any lower down her lap, Visenya suddenly opened her bright violet eyes, sat up smoothly on the bench, and announced in a clear, firm voice that the bath was officially at an end for the evening. I briefly pondered whether I should push the boundaries and insist on continuing the massage further down her legs, feeling fairly confident she would likely tolerate the boldness, but ultimately decided against pressing my luck. After washing myself clean in a fresh basin of cold water and drying off with a thick linen towel after mother left, I quickly pulled on a clean velvet doublet and breeches, suddenly realizing that my immediate situation had gotten slightly more complicated. While it was well past midnight and the vast majority of the Red Keep's occupants were fast asleep in their chambers, I still needed to navigate the dark, twisting stone corridors of the castle and return to my own quarters without being spotted by gossiping servants or overly suspicious Kingsguard. Slipping quietly out of the bath chamber, I ducked into the deep shadows of the hallway, my soft leather boots making zero sound against the cold flagstones. The castle was dead quiet, save for the faint whistling of the sea wind through the high arrow slits and the distant, rhythmic footsteps of an armored guard patrolling the lower courtyards. I moved with fluid, practiced stealth, keeping my back pressed against the dark tapestry-draped walls and darting from pillar to pillar whenever a torchbearer passed in the distance. As I successfully navigated the maze of corridors and slipped back into the safety of my private bedchamber, I pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me, dropping the iron latch into place with a quiet, satisfying click. Stepping over to the window, I looked out across the sprawling, black expanse of King's Landing glowing under the pale light of the moon. Man, life was good. I sure as hell hoped nothing bad would happen. Chapter 22. I leaned back against the high wooden bench, resting my elbows on the grease-stained oak, and slowly cast my eyes across the chaos of the hall. Tonight marked the conclusion of the Crown's victory tourney, and as custom dictated, a feast was currently underway inside the great hall of my father's fortress. The number of attendees packed into the room was far smaller than one might expect for a celebration of this magnitude, owing entirely to the fact that the hall had never been built to accommodate half the nobility of Westeros when Aegon first raised these walls. Even after years of continuous expansions, stone additions, and defensive fortifications, the Grand Chamber remained stubbornly cramped, reeking of roasted boar fat, spilled arbor wine, burning tallow candles, and the sweat of 200 heavily perfumed aristocrats. Still, virtually every Lord Paramount, small council member, and high-born heir who had traveled to King's Landing managed to squeeze themselves inside, eager to drink the king's mead and gorge on garlic-rubbed capons. Up on the raised dais at the high table, I could see my father, King Aegon, sipping leisurely from a heavy silver chalice of dark red wine. Beside him sat my mother, Queen Visenya, looking monumentally bored as she rested her sharp chin upon her pale fist, her bright violet eyes drifting lazily over the drunkards below. On the other side of the king sat my frail elder brother, Crown Prince Aenys, methodically picking at a slice of cold pigeon pie with the enthusiasm of a man eating sawdust. Only a short while ago, I had been sitting up there beside them, trapped in the rigid stifling atmosphere of royal etiquette, but I had eventually grown annoyed with the dull political chatter, veiled insults and slipped down to the lower tables to drink with the squires and young lords instead. Honestly, why would anyone willingly subject themselves to that? It dampened my spirits to become a king. What do you mean I'll have to sit at council with courtiers who knew no better and listen to their endless useless chatter? The great God surely blessed me by giving that responsibility to Aenys because for now, I would simply like to enjoy my time. At the time, it had felt like a brilliant, liberating decision, but as I sat here listening to the endless, deafening jabber around me, I was rapidly beginning to regret my choices. Tell us again, my Lord Prince. By the seven, how in the hell did you manage to unhorse the Kingsguard so cleanly? Tristan Strong gloated at the top of his lungs, his boisterous laugh echoing off the stone walls as he deliberately sighted Stefan Darkland from the corner of his eye. Letting out a heavy, suffering sigh, I rubbed the bridge of my nose, wincing slightly as a sudden coughing fit took hold of me. Davos Baratheon immediately reached over and delivered a bone-shattering slap to my shoulder blades, nearly knocking my head into my plate. Clearly our brave tourney champion is exhausted from carrying the entire honor of the realm on his back, Davos declared with a wide grin, turning his attention to Stefan Darkland, who was currently attempting to hide his face behind a wooden goblet of watered wine, brooding in silence. Allow me to explain the glorious defeat to you instead, Stefan, so you do not miss a single detail. The young Baratheon proceeded to launch into an excruciatingly detailed, play-by-play breakdown of my final tilt against Esser Robin Darkland. Davos mimicked every single lance strike with his thick arms, making absolute sure that the young Darkland heard every agonizing word of his uncle's defeat. By the time Davos reached the part where Esser Robin went airborne and crashed into the dirt like a sack of turnips, Stefan slumped down in his seat, a tired, defeated grin touching his lips as he realized it was simply his designated turn to be tormented by the rest of the crew. All was fair in love and war, after all. I, meanwhile, sat staring down at the wooden cups of watered wine arranged in front of my plate, debating whether a wrists were worth risking over a few sips of fermented grape juice. In the end, I decided to leave the alcohol entirely untouched. I genuinely didn't see the appeal, and getting my liver and kidneys completely wrecked by medieval gutter wine at such a young age was definitely not on my personal life bingo card. Old Bobby B would undoubtedly be heartbroken and disappointed by my absolute lack of drunken degeneracy, but fortunately for my long-term health, the hammer-wielding Baratheon titan wouldn't even be born for another 200 years. Instead, I reached out, grabbed a heavy earthenware mug filled to the brim with scalding hot cow's milk, and downed the entire contents in one long, continuous gulp, wiping the white foam from my upper lip with the back of my sleeve. Man, no wonder Homelander was so obsessed with this stuff. Fresh, hot milk was the absolute undisputed king of dairy beverages, though I was fairly certain the Caped lunatic preferred his milk sourced from a vastly different kind of vendor than the hay-viadored cow currently chewing cud in the castle stables. Ah, sweet seven, I wish I had been knighted with half as much grand fanfare as you, Maegor. Davos sighed heavily, shaking his shaggy head as he leaned back against the bench. There will be sweet-voiced bards singing grand ballads about your heroic glory for the next 50 years because of this day. As for poor Davos, I had to hunt down a band of filthy, Flaretin bandits in the rain and get dubbed in the knee-deep mud while covered in their cheap blood. Not a single lick of poetry or glory in that. Fighting off bandits in the mud is a damn sight more respectable than breaking wooden sticks on a grassy lawn, especially for someone as young as you, I replied casually, setting my empty mug back down on the table. Besides, my friend, comparison is the death of all human happiness. The profound modern philosophy did not seem to have the slightest impact on his mood, as the Baratheon simply smirked, shook his head, and reached for another thigh of roasted capon. A brief, comfortable silence descended over our end of the bench as everyone fell into their own thoughts. Stefan Darklin instantly saw his opening to strike back, his dark eyes glinting with newfound malice as a sly grin spread across his face. You enhorsed my uncle Esser Robin entirely dishonorably, Maegor, Stefan asserted loudly, pointing a grease-stained finger across the table. There was no true knightly honor in dropping low and targeting his arm. A real warrior stands tall in his stirrups. Demon Velaryon let out a loud, mocking snort, his silver-gold hair whipping through the air as he broke into a sharp laugh at the dark accusation. Honor, it was a bloody tourney joust, Stefan, anything goes down on the lists. I fail to see how utilizing superior agility and striking a man's arm joint is remotely dishonorable. It sounds to me like poor old Esser Robin simply got outmaneuvered and might need to consider retiring from his position. Demon's declaration instantly reignited the squire's competitive spirits, and within seconds, the entire table began hounding poor Stefan over his uncle's dramatic defeat, much to the young Darklin's visible annoyance. Even Edwell, who usually did not like to interfere in such matters, joined in with a grin on his face. It was immensely satisfying to have loyal, big-mouthed friends who willingly did all your dirty verbal fighting for you without you ever having to lift a finger. That is precisely what you get, you arrogant little bastard, for daring to accuse me of cheating in front of the entire court. Well, to be completely fair and intellectually honest, I technically was utilizing an unfair mechanical advantage if you took into account the custom high-backed saddle and angled stirrups I had designed, but setting that tiny engineering secret aside, every single strike had been delivered through my own sheer martial skill and lightning reflexes. Besides, actually getting permission to enter the tourney in the first place hadn't been an easy feat. As a last resort, I had been forced to corner the master of the games in a dark hallway, subtly reveal my royal identity, and exert a bit of heavy-handed Targaryen intimidation to force him into allowing a young squire into the official knightly jousts. Turning my body around on the bench to ignore the endless shouting match, I looked out across the hall and noticed that the serving men were actively dragging the long oak tables toward the stone walls, clearing a wide open space in the center of the room for the formal dancing that was scheduled to begin. To be completely honest, I had attended several of these grand formal dances at various feasts over the past few years, and they weren't entirely terrible. They could be a bit dry and tedious at times, but whenever I grew thoroughly bored with the polite posturing, I would simply stand up and wander off to the armory or the kitchens without asking for permission. The single best aspect of these aristocratic gatherings, however, was the incredible opportunity they provided for me to discreetly insult high-born lords and ladies straight to their arrogant faces just to see if their dense medieval brains could actually process the fact that they were being made fun of. Whenever I occasionally got caught red-handed, I would instantly put on a sweet, innocent smile and pretend to be a harmless, naive child who simply didn't know any better. I stared lazily toward the center floor as the court musicians finally tuned their lutes, pipes, and fiddles, breaking into a lively, fast-paced medieval tune. Highborn lords and ladies immediately gathered in long, parallel lines, taking each other's hands and stepping through the traditional, rhythmic dance movements before switching partners at the turn of every stanza. While I might have participated in the festivities with far more enthusiasm had we been celebrating at a lesser castle, tonight I felt remarkably hesitant to join the crowd. The reason behind my reluctance was delightfully simple. The only people granted entrance to tonight's feast were the immediate families of the small council and the high-born representatives of the great houses. At the larger, more chaotic feasts, which were usually crammed with ambitious lesser nobles from minor landed houses, there were always dozens of desperate young ladies willing to do absolutely anything to climb the imperial social ladder. That usually meant leaning down low, subtly brushing their scented bodies against a royal prince, whispering scandalous invitations in your ear, and generally making a complete nuisance of themselves. Just thinking about the entire political dynamic made me sound like a sick pervert in my own head. Now, let us get one crucial detail clear. I was undoubtedly a pervert, but I was a refined, highly selective pervert, not a desperate predator. Shaking my head free of the lingering thoughts, I ran my fingers through my silver hair, pushed myself off the wooden bench, and stood up to stretch my back. Looking around the table, I realized that every single one of my companions had already abandoned their seats to chase after wine cups or flirt with milkmaids, leaving me completely alone. It was officially time for me to make my move as well. While it was funny to ponder all those absurd courtly shit, I was never going to allow myself to be brainlessly led around by Dick. After all, falling for cheap, transparent female manipulation was far too embarrassing for a guy like me. Yet, as if the universe actively enjoyed testing my iron resolve, the moment I stepped onto the polished flagstones near the edge of the dancing area, a striking figure stepped directly into my path, blocking my exit with a sweeping flourish of fine silk. "My Lord Prince," a velvety, melodic voice purred through the music. I looked up to see Lady Eleanor Tyrell standing before me, curtsying low with an agonizingly slow, practiced elegance that offered me a rather generous view of her smooth, cream-colored chest. It took me a long second to recognize her. If I was not wrong, then she was a distant cousin of Theo Tyrell. The only reason I recognized her was because of her looks, particularly her dark, chestnut curls, dark almond eyes, and a voluptuous, hourglass figure that her dressmaker had taken great care to emphasize. She was clad in a gown of sea-green SOC silk, intricately embroidered along the bodice with shimmering golden vines and blooming reach roses made of spun yellow thread. "Lady Eleanor," I replied smoothly, bowing my head just enough to satisfy protocol while offering her my best, most dashing royal smile. I was not aware the flowers of Highgarden bloomed so late into the evening. I internally cringed at the corny line, but as they say, when in Rome, do as Romans do. "They bloom whenever a dragon walks into the garden, Your Grace," she whispered, her dark eyes flashing with sharp, hungry ambition as she extended her delicate, pale hand toward me. Surely the undisputed grand champion of the tourney will not deny a humble maiden a single dance. It would be an absolute crime against the seven to refuse such a vision. I lied seamlessly, taking her small hand in mine and leading her directly onto the crowded wooden floor just as the bards struck up a fast-paced saltarello. The dance required us to step close together, hold hands at eye level, and spin in tight, fluid circles before parting and coming back together. As the music swelled, Lady Eleanor wasted zero time initiating her tactical assault. With every turn of the dance, she deliberately closed the distance between our bodies, her thin, sea-green silk dress sweeping against my velvet doublet. As we spun through a quick turn, she aggressively leaned forward, her soft, warm breasts pressing firmly against my chest, the sheer pressure of her full bust pushing through the fabric of her bodice as her sweet, rosewater-scented breath washed over my collarbone. "They say you ride your warhorse with the fierce, wild power of a fully grown man, Prince Maegor," she murmured softly into my ear, her plump, painted lips brushing against my earlobe as her delicate fingers traced a slow line up my shoulder. "I wonder, do you possess that same relentless stamina in all your grand endeavors?" As the dance rhythm dictated a close embrace, I instinctively placed my broad palm flat against the small of her back, my fingers naturally sliding lower to rest upon the soft, lush curve of her wide hip and backside. The flesh beneath the smooth silk was remarkably soft, warm, and yieldingly pliant under my hand, and I couldn't resist giving her rounded hip a subtle, appreciative squeeze as we spun across the floor. Outwardly, I offered her a dark, deeply sinful grin, leaning down to whisper right back into her ear. "My stamina is the stuff of legends, my lady. You would do well not to test it unless you are fully prepared for the heat of dragonfire." She let out a soft, delighted gasp, her dark eyes flashing as she pressed herself even tighter against my hip, clearly believing her intoxicating feminine charm was working its magic on the young prince. Meanwhile, behind my smiling, very handsome facade, it is paramount to the plot that mentioned my very handsome looks, my brain was rolling its eyes so hard it almost detached a nerve. She really thought 2 firm reach tits, a nice rose perfume, and some heavy silk embroidery were going to turn me into her family's personal political puppet. I mean, it wasn't that bad of an offer in my opinion, but self-respect at all that. You get the point. Before she could press her advantage any further, the song reached its natural cadence, and the traditional rotation of partners forced us to part ways. Lady Eleanor offered me a lingering, promise-filled look as she melted back into the crowd, only for her place to be instantly taken by another highborn predator who had clearly been waiting in the wings for her turn. Lady Alice Vance of the Riverlands stepped into my arms without a single second of hesitation. This time, I really had to rack my brain to come up with her identity. Honestly, I was rather disappointed in myself. Why did I remember some random nobody? It seemed that my mother's teaching skills were better than my forgetting ones. She was a taller, beauty with hair the color of spun copper and piercing, icy blue eyes. Her gown was constructed from deep sapphire blue velvet slashed with glittering cloth of silver along the sleeves and torso. These people really spent too much time on their dresses, didn't they? Prince Maegor, Lady Alice purred, taking my right hand and resting her left palm directly upon my chest as the musicians transitioned into a slow, rhythmic pavane. I must confess, watching you tear through those brute Westermen on the lists was the most thrilling sight I have ever witnessed. As we glided across the polished stone floor, Lady Alice proved to be far more physically aggressive than her reach predecessor. With every slow, deliberate step of the pavane, she intentionally pushed her body flush against mine. Her soft, heavy breasts pressed directly against my chest with every breath she took, the thick velvet of her bodice doing absolutely nothing to disguise the firm, intoxicating warmth of her body. As we turned near a dark pillar, she deliberately misstepped, sliding her leg between mine and leaning her entire body weight into me, her soft stomach and hips grinding lightly against my thigh. The riverlands are vast and rich, my prince, she whispered, her icy eyes looking up into mine with unvarnished, predatory desire as her hand slid down my arm to rest heavily on my belt. My father controls 3 major river crossings. A strong, ambitious prince with a house like mine behind him could accomplish truly terrifying things. I resisted the urge to snort and burst out laughing. What kind of offer was that to a prince of House Targaryen? I didn't miss a single beat of the dance. Reaching around her waist, my hand settled firmly upon the plush, soft curve of her backside, my fingers sinking into the thick sapphire velvet as I held her flush against my body to prevent her from falling. The flesh beneath my hand was wonderfully soft, thick, and wonderfully shaped, and I allowed my palm to rest there for a few extra seconds, enjoying the physical sensation while guiding her smoothly through the turn. Your father's river crossings are indeed impressive, Lady Alice, I responded smoothly, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous gravel as I looked straight into her blue eyes. But I have always preferred flying over rivers rather than paying tolls to cross them. A shiver visibly ran down her spine at my tone, her lips parting as her chest heaved against my doublet, her fingers tightening around my biceps as if she were desperately trying to anchor herself to my strength. Inwardly, however, I was trying not to cringe and laugh at the political theater. God Almighty, did these lords literally train their daughters in the art of aggressive chest bumping? She was practically trying to suffocate me with velvet. Actually, they probably did train their daughters in that aspect. Honestly, I could respect the grind it took to up to a prince and make these kind of offers. As the pavane came to an end, I gracefully bowed to Lady Alice, leaving her breathing heavily by the pillar, and immediately found myself pulled into a third dance by Lady Jane Westerling. She was surprised that I did not expect on seeing, according to the lore, the woman was supposed to be the 5th or 6th wife of the original Maegor. I had seen her from afar before, but never gotten the opportunity to talk to her, which was a shame, because I was very interested in getting to know her. As the lute struck up a fast-paced, lively trot, Lady Jane stepped directly into my space with remarkable grace, wrapping her long, slender arms around my neck and pressing her firm, perky breast straight into my chest before we had even taken 3 steps across the floor. My lord prince, she murmured softly, her sweet, berry-scented breath warming the skin of my neck as she pressed her small, tight waist flush against mine. Her voice lacked the heavy, desperate pretense of the other maidens, instead, there was a light, quiet amuse in her tone. The entire hall has been talking of your victory all evening, though half the lords seem quite unsure whether to toast you or fear you. Fear me, I doubted that, but I was willing to accept some idle ego-stroking. As we spun through the dizzying rotation of the dance, her hands roamed smoothly across my shoulders, her fingers lightly trailing along the back of my neck. During a sudden, dramatic cadence in the music, she leaned back, exposing the long, delicate line of her throat, before pulling herself back up and deliberately pressing her soft, tight bust straight into my chest once more, letting out a soft laugh as she met my gaze. I caught her effortlessly around the waist, my right hand resting low on her hips, feeling the supple, extremely soft flesh beneath the cool crimson satin. I gave her hips a firm, commanding pull, bringing her lower body right up against mine as I spun her around the floor with flawless, practiced grace. And does terrifying half the lords of the realm make me poor company for a dance, Lady Jane? I asked with a fake chuckle, looking down into her wide, observant eyes with a warm smile. Not in the slightest, she replied smoothly, her icy eyes sparkling with humor. I have always found that men who frighten foolish lords are far more interesting to speak with than the lords themselves. Not a very cringe-worthy response, I can respect that. No ridiculous theatrical speeches about burning in dragonfire, no rehearsed lines straight out of a cheap romance novel. Though what tickled my brain was the fact that she was alive. If my knowledge was not wrong, then she should have not been born by now. Then again, the wiki was never very specific when it came to the birth of the people not born in main timeline. She did look young however, older than me for sure though. When the final song concluded with a loud flourish of trumpets and lutes, the crowd erupted into thunderous applause. I offered Lady Jane a bow, taking her small hand and brushing my lips lightly against her knuckles. She offered me a smile before turning to rejoin her ladies, leaving me to smoothly retreat toward the shadowed perimeter of the hall before another maiden could intercept me. Wiping a light sheen of sweat from my forehead, I grabbed a fresh cup of cold water from a passing servant's tray and leaned back against a cold stone pillar, watching the rest of the feast unfold from a safe distance. That had been interesting, and as my gaze flickered around the room, there were quite a lot more interesting people that I could dance with, but now my social battery has dried up, and I only wished to fall into my bed and fall asleep. Standing there indecisively for a moment, I looked around and saw that my friends were still dancing, and I could even spot Annie's from here. Curiously, however, neither my mother or Alyssa were here at this moment. With my mind made up, I simply turned on my heel and left. Chapter 23. I skipped over a slick, algae-covered boulder and landed smoothly on the opposite jagged ledge, my boots finding instant traction on the wet stone before I turned my body around to look back. Behind me, Alyssa Velaryon stood perched precariously atop a salt-crusted rock, looking up at me with a helpless, breathtaking smile that could have melted a glacier. The sea wind whipped her silver-gold hair across her pale face. The moonlight cast its glow against her gown of sheer, sapphire-blue Myrish silk. The fabric clung to every single contour of her figure like a second skin, molded tight around her curves. The silky folds of her skirts fell in waves around her legs. Honestly, she looked like a ghost to me, like the girl had crawled out of the sea with her ethereal glow to take me under the waves or some bullshit like that. Alyssa gathered the trailing edges of her heavy skirts in her hands, attempting to take a cautious step forward across the slippery gap, only for her foot to catch on a wet patch of sea moss. She let out a sharp, delicate gasp as her balance failed completely, tumbling forward and landing squarely on her knees upon the cold, hard stone. Man, why in the hell would anyone wear a gown like that out into the wild like this? That piece of clothing probably made basic walking an Olympic sport, let alone navigating a jagged coastline. Then again, we had both just slipped out of the fort after I had found her while wandering in the halls to catch a breath of fresh air. On a mutual whim, we had decided to slip past the sleeping guards and head straight down to a secret spot, the dark, isolated cliffs framing Blackwater Bay. Looking out at the black water chittering against the shore, I realized it was a damn good thing the high tide hadn't come rolling in yet, or we would be royally fucked, trapped against the sheer cliff face with nowhere to climb. Did anyone in this medieval fantasy world actually know how to read lunar tide charts, or were they all just raw-dogging ocean currents and hoping for the best? Before I could get completely derailed by that train of thought, I quickly stepped back across the gap, leaned over Alyssa, and lifted her straight off the hard ground by grabbing her firmly under her armpits. The moment my hands made contact with her ribs, the Velaryon girl twisted uncomfortably in my grip, her body thrashing lightly as she squirmed against my hands, trying desperately to suppress a sudden urge to giggle because she was ticklish. "Easy there," I muttered with a laugh, holding her steady above the rocks. Just as I was about to remove my hands from her arms and take a step backward to give her space, Alyssa unexpectedly leaned her entire weight directly into my chest. Her warm, sweet breath tickled the sensitive skin of my collarbone. "Ouch," she whimpered softly, her voice trailing off into a gentle murmur. I think I might have sprained my ankle, Maegor." She avoided my eyes as I leaned my head back to look at her. Instead, she wrapped her long, slender arms tightly around my neck, burying her face deep into the warm hollow between my shoulder and throat, her soft chest pressing flat against my chest. "I should have known better than to bring a high-born lady out to the cliffs when she is dressed like a siren," I said, letting out a heavy sigh as her sweet fragrance filled my senses. I almost got lost in thought, wondering if sirens existed in this world before writing myself. "Forgive me, my lady." Alyssa did not pull away. Her grip on my neck tightened, her full lips brushing lightly against my pulse point as she whispered, "Do not say that. It was as much my decision to come down here as yours." Sighing again, I shifted my footing on the slick rock, reached one arm behind her back, slid the other beneath the smooth curve of her knees, and lifted her cleanly off the ground in a classic bridal carry. Alyssa was surprisingly light in my arms, though it was hard to tell if she was truly weightless or if my relentless, grueling physical workouts over the past few years had simply turned me into a human forklift. Her golden silver hair tickled the tip of my nose as she buried her face deeper into my neck, her hands clutching at the leather of my doublet for security. I could feel the incredible warmth of her body seeping through my clothes, the soft, plush flesh of her thighs resting securely against my right forearm. I hummed a quiet, non-committal response before taking a deep breath and leaping from the rock I was standing on straight onto another narrow ledge 3 feet away. I like LARPing as an elf right now. A dark, hyperregal elf knight straight out of a fantasy novel. Yes, absolutely. I had the pale silver hair, the striking Valyrian looks, the knightly vows, and the superhuman physical strength to back it up. Perhaps that last part was a bit of an exaggeration in my own head, but as far as I was concerned, I was close enough to Legolas to count it. Besides, it was the sacred duty of a noble knight to rescue a beautiful damsel in distress, it is known. Unfortunately, my arrogant, ridiculous train of thought almost cost us both our lives. My left boot clipped the wet edge of a mossy stone, sending my footing sliding sideways. I let out a sharp curse, my heart leaping straight into my throat as I frantically shifted my balance, clutching Alyssa tightly to my chest and digging my heels into a dry crevice at the very last microsecond before we both went tumbling into the dark sea below. Phew, that was way too close. If I had gotten us injured down here on the sharp barnacles, both of us would have been forced to sit on a cold rock waiting for the midnight tide to sweep in, leaving us with no choice but to swim a mile back to the harbor in pitch-black darkness when the tide came. Slipping out of the castle without a single Kingsguard or personal Monad arms late at night was definitely not the brightest idea I had ever come up with, but here I was anyway. Pushing forward with renewed focus, I reached my intended destination much sooner than expected, a secluded, ancient sea cave embedded deep into the base of the towering rock cliffs. The interior was shrouded in deep, dramatic shadows, but the pale, silver moonlight reflecting off the surface of the bay provided just enough light for us to navigate the smooth stone floor inside. I walked deep into the sanctuary of the cave and gently lowered Alyssa back down onto her feet, though she took her sweet time withdrawing her face from my neck. She slowly leaned back, resting her hands against my chest as she looked up at me. It was difficult to read her exact expressions in the gloom, as the deep shadows obscured her features, but the moonlight caught her eyes, making her bright, luminous amethyst irises glow like burning gems in the dark. "Thank you for carrying me, Maegor," she murmured softly, her voice echoing gently off the damp cave walls. She paused for a long, thoughtful moment, her eyes searching my face before she added, "You have grown remarkably strong since I last saw you." "Hard work, heavy lifting, and eating every scrap of good food I can lay my hands on," I replied with an easy shrug, leaning my back against the rough, damp stone wall of the cave and regarding her with genuine curiosity. Over the past several years, despite the immense physical distance separating Dragonstone, Driftmark, and King's Landing, the two of us had managed to maintain a remarkably close friendship through a constant stream of private letters and secret meetings whenever our families happened to be in the same castle. We were practically childhood best friends at this point. A comfortable, tranquil silence settled over the small cavern. Alyssa smoothed her ruined silk skirts beneath her and drew her knees up close to her chest, resting her chin upon her arms as she listened to the rhythmic, thunderous crashing of the ocean waves against the rocks outside. I began humming a quiet, familiar tune under my breath, feeling the heavy exhaustion of the day finally catching up to my muscles. Today had been an absurdly productive day. Between winning the tourney, thinking about my engineering of drycard compasses, and dodging gold-digging noble maidens at the feast, I really ought to have been fast asleep in my feather bed by now, dreaming sweet dreams. To keep my heavy eyelids from closing entirely, I turned my head toward her and asked, "Alyssa, what is your dream in life?" The Velaryon maiden did not move or answer right away, remaining so still that I briefly wondered if she had even heard my voice over the sound of the surf. After a long, lingering silence, she slowly turned her head toward me, her violet eyes flashing in the pale moonlight. "My dream," she repeated softly, her palms folding neatly in her lap as she contemplated the question. I truly do not know." She let out a quiet, bitter chuckle at her own expense, shaking her head softly. "That sounds utterly pathetic, does it not? When I was a little girl, I thought my purpose was simple: make my lord father proud, bring honor to House Velaryon, eventually marry a grand lord, and bear him a nursery full of healthy children. But now that I am older, I am not certain I want any of those things. I am not certain of anything at all." A subtle note of desperation crept into her voice at the end, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the anxiety. She let out a long sigh, turning her gaze back toward me. "You will probably figure it out sooner or later," I offered helpfully, blinking rapidly to stave off the creeping drowsiness. "People change as they grow up, and so do their ideals and interests. It is completely normal not to have your whole life mapped out at 16. Alyssa stared at me intensely through the darkness, her luminous eyes searching my face before a small, melancholic smile formed on her lips. "I suppose I envy your conviction, Maegor. No matter what the people say about you, no matter what obstacles stand in your path, you never stray from your direction." Another stretch of quiet descended upon the cave, during which I was actively fighting off internal demons just to stay awake and keep my eyes open. Finally, Alyssa rescued me from my slipping consciousness as she shifted her position on the stone floor, sliding closer to me until her legs were resting directly against mine, the heat of her skin radiating through her sheer silk dress. I turned my head to look at her, staring through the dark gloom to make out the subtle shifts in her facial expression. She seemed to be locked in a desperate, internal battle with herself, her breath coming in short, uneven hitches. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, she looked straight into my eyes and confessed in a trembling whisper, I do not want to be betrothed to Prince Aenys. That single sentence acted like a bucket of ice water dumped straight over my head, snapping me instantly out of my sleepy haze. It turned out I possessed some ancient, gossip-hungry anti-genetics buried deep within my DNA, because my brain immediately sat up straight, eager to hear every single bit of juicy drama. Wrapping her long arms tightly around her waist as if she were suddenly freezing cold, Alyssa continued in a raw, mournful tone. I do not know what to do, Maegor. I truly do not. Aenys is kind, gentle, and polite. There is absolutely nothing wrong with him as a man, yet I cannot bring myself to feel a single spark of affection for him. Am I a terrible person for feeling this way? Should I hate myself for being so ungrateful? I kept my mouth shut, remaining completely silent as the heavy waves crashed against the cliff rocks outside, giving her all the time and space she needed to let the buried poison out of her system. My Lord Father told me privately before the feast that our formal betrothal will likely be announced before the end of the year, she choked out, her head dropping helplessly toward her knees as tears welled in her eyes. I do not want it. I do not want any of it. I do not want to be handed away like a piece of property to secure a political alliance. Suddenly, Alyssa lifted her head, a sudden, wildfire igniting deep within her violet eyes that I had never seen before. For once in my life, I want to have control over my own destiny. Before I could even open my mouth to offer a comforting word or a piece of modern advice, Alyssa unwrapped her arms from around her waist and looked deeply, dangerously into my eyes. She pulled her long legs back beneath her, rising onto her hands and knees until her body was suspended right above the smooth cavern floor. You are my closest friend in this entire wretched world, Maegor, she whispered, her voice laced with an intoxicating mixture of desperation, rebellion, and passion. Only you can save me from this fate. Her body moved sinuously through the dark shadows like a hunting panther, crawling slowly toward me across the flat stone. The moonlit silk of her gown clung tightly to her back as she arched her spine, revealing the deep, dramatic curve of her rear and the plunging, low-cut front of her bodice that threatened to spill her full, firm breasts into the open air with every breath she took. She crawled right between my legs, reaching out with one delicate hand to rest her palm high upon my inner thigh, her fingers digging firmly into the muscle. She used her other hand to grab my shoulder, anchoring herself to me, and in that instant, I realized with a sudden jolt of electricity that the girl had never sprained her ankle in the first place. Pulling my head forward until our faces were barely an inch apart, she breathed her sweet, hot, berry-scented air directly across my lips, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Ruin me, Alyssa whispered, her voice a dark, hypnotic spell echoing off the ancient stone. Defile me right here on these cold rocks and make me yours forever. Make it so that no king, no lord, and no brother can ever take me away from you. Before my brain could even process the absolute madness of her proposition, she closed the remaining distance and pressed her soft, burning lips directly against mine. The kiss was wild, and completely uninhibited. Her mouth parted against mine, her tongue sliding forward as she wrapped her arms tightly around my neck, pulling my body up into hers as the roar of the dark ocean echoed all around us. Chapter 24. Alyssa paused against me, her trembling breath fanning hot across my neck until I could feel the feverish heat radiating off her body, the blue Myrish silk of her dress doing absolutely nothing to obscure the soft, supple press of her skin against mine. Before my brain could even process the sheer insanity of the situation, she wound her long legs tight around my waist and sat down squarely in my lap, her weight trapping me firmly against the icy, damp stone wall at my back. Her mouth opened against mine in a wildly, the kiss deepening with an uninhibited desperation as her fingers tangled in the pale hair at the nape of my neck. She pulled herself closer still, burying her soft body into mine until the warm swell of her chest was crushed flat against my leather doublet. My hand slid instinctively up and down the delicate curve of her spine, feeling the sharp, involuntary shudder that ran through her frame as I gripped her narrow waist, gently applying pressure to pull her back just an inch so I could breathe. This whole situation was heading toward an unmitigated political disaster, and I could see the impending fallout as clearly as a bright summer day. I was going to be utterly, royally fucked if I didn't handle this with precision right now. The main, glaring problem was what would happen if the news of tonight ever managed to reach the sharp ears of her father, Lord Ethan Velaryon, or worse, my father. Sure, I doubted Aegon would do anything too drastically lethal to his own prince, considering the fact that Aenys and Alyssa weren't formally betrothed by decree just yet, but I severely doubted anyone on the small council was going to applaud my sudden lack of self-control. What to do, what to do? Every single scenario that flashed through my head seemed progressively worse than the last the more I dissected the strategic board. At long last, I broke the intense kiss, sliding my hands up to cup Alyssa's soft, warm face between my palms. Her eyes remained closed for a long, heavy moment, her chest heaving as she caught her breath, before her eyelids slowly fluttered open. In the deep shadows of the cavern, the striking purple of her Valyrian eyes glowed like twin polished amethysts catching the silver moonlight. Alyssa, I need to ask you something, and I need you to give me an honest answer, I said, my voice sounding absurdly grounded against the thunderous roar of the tide outside. Her slender arms tightened around my shoulders, pressing her chest flush against mine as she nuzzled her face into the hollow of my neck. For a brief second, I wondered if she had consumed a bit too much sweet arbor gold at the feast, though I doubted it. The warm air coming from her parted lips didn't carry the heavy, sour reek of unwatered wine. Are you absolutely certain of what you are asking for right now? I pressed, forcing her to lean back slightly so she had no choice but to look me straight in the eye. The Velaryon girl trembled within my hands, a sudden, fleeting shadow of hesitation passing over her delicate features. I remained perfectly still, giving her all the time in the world to make her own choice, even as I was sweating buckets. While my father, King Aegon, was distant and aloof from my day-to-day life, surely he wouldn't banish his own son over a dark cavern scandal, right? Lord Ethan Velaryon, on the other hand, was a proud sea lord who commanded the entire royal fleet. He was definitely the immediate threat I needed to worry about, though a contingency plan was already beginning to take form in the back of my brain the more I pondered our options. This is my final decision, Maegor, Alyssa whispered, a sudden, burning resolve igniting in her dark purple eyes before her shoulders slumped in a quiet surrender. She looked up at me with raw vulnerability. However, I would entirely understand if you chose to refuse me. I know what this asks of you. It looked as though she wanted to say more, but her throat bobbed painfully, her breath hitching as her eyes glistened with unshed tears in the dim light. I paused, the gears in my brain churning at maximum speed. The girl looked utterly defeated, sitting there in the dark waiting for my rejection while I debated the ramifications. I weighed the risks, considered the inevitable court drama, and reached my final, indisputable conclusion. Fuck it, we ball. Grabbing the soft skin at the back of her neck, I pulled her back in close, burying her face against mine as her fragrant, silver gold hair tickled my nose. Her wet, soft lips met mine with a fierce, intoxicating desperation, her arms wrapping tight around my broad shoulders, pulling with all her strength until there wasn't a single millimeter of empty air left between our bodies. She let out a soft, breathless gasp as my hands caressed her face, my fingers trailing down the graceful column of her neck to reach the thin, delicate strap of blue Myrish silk hanging loosely off her shoulder. With a deliberate, gentle push, I peeled the silk down, repeating the motion on the other side until the embroidered bodice fell away. We leaned back from the embrace, taking each other in under the pale moonlight. Her lips were parted as she drew in ragged, heavy breaths, looking far more swollen and kissed than they had a few minutes prior. The top of her magnificent gown now rested loosely around her waist. Her perky breasts hung loosely in the air as I stared down at them, their teardrop shape was perfect and meant to be held onto. Realizing her sudden exposure, Alyssa instinctively brought one pale arm across her chest, a sudden wave of embarrassment flushing her cheeks, but I gently took her wrist and pulled her back toward me. You are breathtaking, Alyssa, I murmured against her ear. The soft words seemed to work an instant charm, melting away her lingering shame as her hands found their way back to my shoulders. Clumsily, her slender fingers began tugging at the laces of my leather doublet, attempting to pull it off without much success. Taking pity on her awkward attempts, I reached down, pulled the thick garment over my head in one smooth motion, and laid the soft leather flat across the stone floor behind her. Pushing her down gently, I made sure her bare back never touched the cold, jagged floor of the cavern, placing her safely atop my doublet instead. Her long, pale silver gold hair fanned out around her head like a halo of spun moonlight as she lay beneath me. She refused to meet my gaze directly for a fleeting second, her long lashes casting dark shadows over her cheeks, while the silver moonlight poured through the mouth of the cave, casting an ethereal glow over her pale features. I clasped her cheek in the warm palm of my hand, gently tilting her chin until her purple eyes locked onto mine once more. Her lips parted softly, a quiet whimpering sound escaping her throat as my hand traced down the long curve of her neck to rest upon her waist. The sheer silk dress was bunched up around her hips, revealing the smooth, endless pale skin of her thighs and the delicate, graceful arch of her ribs. Her stomach was taut and flexed involuntarily with goosebumps. Turning her face, I made her me in the eye. Her eyes were wide, pupils blown black with desire and fear, and when I pressed my thumb against her lower lip, she parted for me, her tongue darting out to taste my skin with hesitant curiosity, and my eyes traveled down to her breasts, pale and perfect, though obscured in the dark shadows. My hand rose, almost without my permission, and cupped one soft orb, feeling the weight of it, the heat, the way her heart hammered against my palm. Alyssa whimpered around my thumb, her thighs rubbing together. She looked beautiful, with her eyes squeezed shut and her face flushed and her body arching up toward me. I leaned down and took her nipple into my mouth, swirling my tongue around the hardened peak, tasting salt and skin and the taste of lavender oil. MMPH. She gasped, her hips bucking up against mine, seeking friction. Her fingers tangled in my hair, pulling me closer, demanding more even as she gasped at the intensity of it. I lavished attention on first one breast, then the other, using my hands and mouth to drive her to the edge of madness. She trembled beneath me like a plucked harp string. I pulled back, my breathing ragged, and looked down at her. She stared up at me with wide, wondering eyes, her chest heaving, her lips parted in an expression of dazed pleasure. R18 skip. I collapsed beside her, my arms shaking, my breath uneven for a moment before I rolled my head to look at her. She was unconscious, or near enough to make no difference. Her eyes were closed, her lips swollen and parted, the tip of her tongue visible between them. She looked thoroughly used, thoroughly claimed. I stared up at the cave ceiling and wondered what in the name of all the gods I was going to do now. To put it simply, I was well and truly fucked, literally and figuratively. Chapter 25. I stood beside the high, narrow window of my solar, looking out over the gray waters of the bay where the early dawn mist clung to the surface like a wet shroud. Down in the harbor, the masts of the royal fleet rose through the fog like a forest of winter-stripped trees, creaking softly against the tide. I took a slow sip of the warm milk from the silver chalice in my hand, letting the heat settle in my throat. It was sweetened with a dollop of wild honey and a pinch of crushed cloves, just the way the castle cooks made it when they thought I was brooding. Today was going to be a monumental day, well maybe. Either it was going to go disastrously bad, or disastrously good. Only time would tell for sure, but I needed this meeting to go right. The alternative was getting banished to fuck-ass Essos, or somewhere even worse, simply because I had bedded a girl who was not even betrothed to my brother yet, but I doubted they could be that harsh. If the news got out in the first place, that is. I had made double sure that no guard or servant had seen us sneaking back through the subterranean tunnels from the cliffs, but in a place like this, shadows had ears and walls had eyes. Essos was not entirely terrible if you liked mercenaries, spices, and special brothels, but running away across the narrow sea would completely wreck every single long-term plan I had. I set the silver chalice down with a dull clink onto the dark, polished wood of the long trestle table and walked over to the tall wall mirror framed in carved weirwood to inspect my drippy as hell fit. Because the weight of the occasion demanded proper theater, I had dressed in a floor-length tailored tunic of midnight black velvet, its high collar secured tightly at my throat with silver dragon claw clasps. A central panel of textured charcoal silk framed my torso, trimmed with sharp crimson piping and jagged clusters of blood-red ruby beadwork that spilled across my shoulders like glistening scales. The three-headed dragon of House Targaryen was embroidered prominently on the back in heavy red thread, while a long, silver-studded leather belt hung low from my waist above dark, fitted riding gauntlets. I flexed my fingers in front of my chest, striking a pose to admire the sheer drip of it all. Even Piccolo would have been proud of a fit this immaculate. Draped over my broad shoulders was a heavy, obsidian black velvet cloak pinned at my collarbone with silver dragon heads. It fell in sweeping, weight-heavy folds all the way to the stone floor, trailing behind me and wrapping my frame like a shadow of pure authority. If I had to pick a favorite, the cloak was easily the best part of the whole ensemble. Who in their right mind had not dreamed of wearing a sweeping cloak while plotting something evil? Back in my previous life, any cloak you could buy was made of cheap, itchy polyester that looked like a Halloween costume. Over here, however, the heavy velvet felt like real armor, thick enough to turn a chilled draft and dark enough to swallow the light. The sharp bark of knuckles against heavy oak shattered the quiet. I moved away from the glass instantly, walking with slow, deliberate steps toward the high-backed chair of carved black oak set at the far end of the room and sat down, crossed one leg tightly over my knee, and let out a soft, sharp whistle. From the shadows near the cold stone hearth, the fat bastard of a cat stirred. He took his sweet time rising, stretching his hind legs one by one before waddling toward my chair with all the grace of a sack of wet turnips. Pausing at my boots, the cat looked up at the height of my seat, made a lazy attempt to jump, and failed miserably, thumping his fat belly against the carved wooden leg before landing back on the floor. I grit my teeth in annoyance at his sheer uselessness, reached down, picked the heavy bastard up manually, and dumped him squarely on my lap. Don Corleone, no wait, Don Targaryen was ready for action now. I was fairly certain the Godfather himself would have applauded my sheer theatrics. Enter, I commanded smoothly, stroking the coarse fur of the fat bastard, who had already purred once and promptly closed his eyes to doze off. I wished I could have found a more terrifying cat, but this lazy mouser was the only creature available on short notice. It made me wonder how the hell he had survived after so many years without dying off, but I dispelled the thought, running a hand through my pale hair to ensure every strand was sleeked back. The heavy oak door creaked inward, cutting off the distant, muffled footsteps of sentries patrolling the upper gallery. Lord Ethan Velaryon stepped past the threshold, adjusting the silver sea snake clasp at his high collar. He was a proud, weather-beaten veteran of the seas, his face lined by years of salt spray and sun, his pale eyes sharp as daggers beneath bushy white brows. His silver-gold hair was braided neatly back behind his ears, fresh from the previous evening's feast. He paused just inside the room, his SEA-accustomed eyes adjusting to the dim twilight illuminated only by the dying embers in the hearth. "You come to me on the day of my daughter's wedding, I muttered in a raspy voice in my head. Wait, wrong script. You requested a private audience at this ungodly hour of the morning, Prince Maegor? Ethan asked, his voice rough as grinding stones. His pale eyes narrowed with immediate suspicion as he looked at me sitting in the shadows. My prince, this had better not be some royal jest or a waste of my quartermaster's time. He tried to maintain the formal deference owed to a prince of the blood, but he failed to hide the slight amount of annoyance on his face. I stared at him with hard, unblinking eyes, idly stroking the fat tomcat in my lap with a blank expression. I raised one gloved hand and pointed a single finger at the heavy oak chair sitting empty across the dark table. Close the door behind you, Lord Ethan, I said smoothly, keeping my tone deceptively level. And sit down. I intend to marry your daughter, and I prefer my future father-in-law comfortably seated before we begin negotiating her betrothal. Ethan Velaryon went deathly still. For 3 agonizing seconds, the silence in the solar was so thick that the only sound in the castle was the subtle crackle of sap popping in the hearth fire. What did you just say to me? Ethan asked quietly, his voice dropping an octave into a low, dangerous register that had probably terrified piratical captains in the southern seas. You heard me perfectly fine, I replied, reaching out with my free hand to take a slow, unhurried sip from my silver chalice. Yummy milk. I said I am going to marry Alyssa. So, close that door, sit your rear in that chair, take a breath, and let us discuss this matter like proper men. A wave of pure, high-born fury flushed across the Lord of the Tides' weathered face, turning his tanned cheeks a dark, mottled red. Was deliberately antagonizing a hardened naval commander the safest tactic? Probably not, but watching a proud Westerosi lord process shock was far too satisfying to pass up, though I probably had a few too many screws loose in my head. He took 2 aggressive, heavy steps toward the table, his right hand instinctively falling to the pommel of the ornate steel dagger resting at his hip. Have you lost your mind, boy? Ethan spat, his pale eyes blazing with outrage at the sheer, unthinkable audacity of the 16-year-old prince sitting before him. Alyssa is to be promised to Prince Aenys. The king and I have only spoken of it in absolute secrecy. We agreed to arrange the match at the end of the year. No one in this castle knows of it. Do you truly believe you can drag the Lord of Driftmark into a dark room at dawn, utter a few outrageous words, and steal the crown prince's bride? I did not flinch or even shift my legs. I merely looked up at the furious lord with cold, deliberate amusement while the fat beast in my lap rustled his fur and let out a soft snoring sound. Aenys may wear a gold band on his head one day, Lord Ethan, but a crown perched on a fragile skull is nothing more than a shiny target, I said, my voice entirely devoid of panic. You are an admiral. You have captained steel-trimmed warships through violent storms in the narrow sea. Tell me, when the sky turns black and the waves break over the bow, do you want a steady, iron-willed captain at the helm, or a sickly boy who gets seasick looking at a harbor map? Not my best metaphors, maybe even a little cringy, but you gotta make use of whatever is available to you. Forgive me for throwing you under the bus, Aenys my dear brother, but necessity drives the cart. Besides, it was not like he was ever going to hear this conversation anyway, so no harm done. That is flat betrayal, Ethan snarled, slamming his broad, calloused palm onto the dark oak table with a sound like a crossbow shot. He is your brother, he is the king's firstborn heir. That is realpolitik, Lord Ethan, and you know it as well as I do, I countered smoothly, setting the chalice down with a soft, metallic click, but not before taking one last satisfying swig of warm milk. Aenys is a sweet lad, but he is soft. The greedy lords of the Reach and the Marches will bleed him dry the moment my father passes into the stranger's realm. A marriage to Aenys buys House Velaryon a queen who spends her days worrying if her husband will survive his next chest cold. A marriage to me buys you an unbreakable, blood-drawn alliance with the most dangerous Targaryen prince in the Seven Kingdoms. Ethan's jaw clenched tight, his heavy chest rising and falling lightly as he glared down at me across the timber. I wondered detachedly for a fraction of a second if the old sailor was actually mad enough to swing at a royal prince. But as I locked eyes with him, I saw the shift. The raw, instinctual anger was still smoldering in his pale eyes, but beneath it, the sharp, calculating mind of a master statesman was churning. And what of King Aegon? Ethan demanded, leaning his upper body over the table, his knuckles white against the wood. Lord Aegon intends to bind our blood to the Iron Throne through his primary line. He will never accept you setting his grand design aside. I met his fierce glare with an icy, unblinking stare, softly stroking the dark fur behind the cat's ears. That's my worry, I said simply. Before Ethan could push the argument any further, I reached into the wide folds of my velvet tunic, pulled out a small, velvet-lined mahogany box, and set it squarely in the middle of the dark table between us, knowing that saying just a few words would not be enough to convince him. Getting your blood into the next generation of the crown was a pretty important matter. Open it, Lord Ethan, I murmured, tilting my head slightly. Curiosity overpowered his outrage and the Lord of Driftmark reached out with a weathered hand and flipped open the polished brass latch. Inside lay a compact, beautifully crafted metallic brass housing holding a floating white card marked with 32 precise directional points, balanced perfectly atop a jeweled pivot. No matter how Ethan tilted the wooden container, the silver needle fixed to the card pointed with unnatural, absolute precision toward the north wall of the room. Ethan picked up the device with calloused, salt-stained fingers, turning it left, then right, then tilting it violently to the side. The internal floating ring adjusted instantly, keeping the card level while the needle remained dead calm, pointing unflinchingly north. "It does not use a bowl of water," Ethan muttered, his rough voice dropping to an odd whisper as the master sailor within him recognized the revolutionary engineering instantly. "It stays flat. Even in heavy rolling swells, this card would remain completely steady. It is a drycard magnetic compass, housed within a brass gimbal system of my own personal design," I explained, leaning my chin casually on my gloved fist. "No stargazing required. No sea fog can hide the horizon from it. A ship equipped with this box can navigate through a pitch-black hurricane in the open sea and hit a harbor mouth within 10 yards of its target." Ethan stared at the mechanism for a long moment, then let out a harsh scoff, setting it back down on the dark oak with a loud, skeptical click. He crossed his thick arms over his heavy leather doublets. "A clever little trick, Prince Maegor," Ethan said, his tone dripping with old sailor cynicism. "But sea captains are an obstinate, superstitious breed of men. They trust the stars, the winds, and their lead lines because their grandfathers trusted them. They will not hand over heavy sacks of silver for a metal toy they do not comprehend. Why would any merchant risk a fortune on a tiny brass box when the old ways have worked for centuries? It will not sell." I let out a low, dark chuckle, wondering briefly how intimidating I looked sitting in the shadows clad in ruby scales and black velvet with a sleepy cat on my lap. Man, I probably looked cool as hell. "You are an admiral of the royal fleet, Lord Ethan," I said, letting my eyes gleam with unshakable confidence. "You should know better than anyone else in Westeros how wild success can be carved out of novelty. Tell me, what would an SOC merchant captain pay when he realizes he can cut 2 weeks off his trade run through the stepstones in thick fog without smashing his wooden hull on the rocks? What will a Bravo CC lord give for a battle fleet that never loses its bearings in a gale? Once your own flagship sails with this box and outmaneuvers every merchant cog in the narrow sea, captains will be tearing down the timber doors of Driftmark to buy one at whatever price I demand." Ethan opened his mouth to refute the claim, but the veteran sailor inside him knew that every word coming out of my mouth was simple, indisputable truth. The commercial dominance represented by this single mechanism was too immense to deny. "I am granting House Velaryon the exclusive manufacturing and maritime distribution rights for this device across the entire known world," I continued, my brain churning through the numbers. "We split the profits 50-50. Which brings me to my second point. Over the next years, I am personally restructuring the economy of Dragonstone. I am building deepwater stone docks, constructing high-yield iron foundries, and declaring Dragonstone a tax-free international trade port for Eastern merchant fleets." Ethan stared at me in disbelief before letting out a sharp, incredulous laugh. Dragonstone. Dragonstone is a barren rock of volcanic ash. You expect me to sit here and believe you can transform a dragon's roost into a merchant haven? "It is a barren rock," I replied with a smile. "Under my direction, it will become the primary maritime trade hub of Blackwater Bay. And if House Velaryon is not my partner in this endeavor, Dragonstone's new deepwater piers will draw every single SOC trade cog away from Driftmark within half a decade." Ethan's mocking smile thinned instantly as those words left my lips. Yet, looking into his eyes, I could see he still held a lingering doubt, unable to fully wrap his mind around the situation. "You threaten to eclipse my house on the sea," Ethan whispered, his pale eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "I offer you an empire, Lord Ethan," I corrected seamlessly, waving one gloved arm dismissively through the air. "Join your fleet to my vision, marry Alyssa to me, and House Velaryon becomes the undisputed titan of the oceans forever." Ethan stood silent, his sharp mind racing through my proposal, but as an experienced ruler of sea lords, he knew he could not simply surrender his leverage. Whether he truly believed in Dragonstone's sudden economic ascension or not, he could not risk letting Dragonstone overshadow Driftmark without securing his own terms. "And what of Alyssa?" Ethan asked slowly, testing the waters. "What makes you so certain she would ever agree to abandon a crown for you?" I leaned back into my black oak chair, recrossing my legs with effortless grace as I stroked the cat on my lap, suppressing the sudden urge to burst out laughing. How was I supposed to break it to the proud lord of the tides that I had already thoroughly defiled his daughter just hours ago? "That is my worry," I replied instead, a knowing smirk playing on my lips. I was well aware I probably looked exceptionally punchable right now. Ethan hummed softly, his gaze dropping back down to the brass compass sitting on the dark wood. He looked at the shining metal, then back to the imposing prince reclining in the gloom before him. He let out a long, heavy exhale, the remaining fire of his outrage finally extinguishing, replaced by the cool, calculating rationality of a commander who recognized a winning hand when he saw one. Slowly, deliberately, Lord Ethan Velaryon reached out, pulled back the heavy oak chair opposite me, and finally sat down. If I am to agree to this match, Prince Maegor, and align my fleet with your ambition, Driftmark will not be left to wither in Dragonstone's shadow, Ethan said, his tone shifting entirely from furious posturing to sharp, businesslike negotiation. We require safeguards. I raised an eyebrow, gesturing with 2 fingers for him to state his terms. First, Ethan declared, resting his heavy hands flat on the timber, House Velaryon warships will hold the exclusive contract for patrolling and securing all sea lanes surrounding Dragonstone. Your new port will pay no direct tariffs to us, but my fleet provides the iron that guards your waters, for a very handsome, fixed annual fee paid directly from your treasury. Acceptable, I conceded smoothly. Your ships know the bay better than anyone alive. The protection fee favored Ethan on the surface, but strategically, it was sort of a win for me right now. I did not possess a personal navy yet. By outsourcing naval defense to Driftmark for a fixed fee, I saved millions of silver stags in timber procurement, shipyard construction, and sailor wages during my early building phase. Of course, the perpetual nature of such a contract was a potential snare. A sovereign prince could never allow a vassal or nominal ally to hold a permanent naval chokehold over his primary home port. But I accepted it without hesitation because I knew the long play. Right now, I was 10 steps behind on sea power. Once I claimed Balerion or constructed my own fleet of iron-ribbed galleys in the years to come, I could easily renegotiate, bypass, or tear up the contract at Sword Point whenever it suited me. Second, Ethan pressed, his pale eyes locked onto mine. All merchant ships flying the Velaryon banner will dock at Dragonstone's deepwater stone piers entirely free of harbor dues, forever. Furthermore, no foreign merchant cog docking at Dragonstone may be granted lower customs duties than those offered at Driftmark. You will not undercut my harbors to starve them. I considered the term for a brief moment, pretending to weigh the economic loss. Agreed. Tariff parity between Dragonstone and Driftmark shall be written directly into the formal trade charter. Ethan was smartly protecting Driftmark from being completely bankrupted by Dragonstone's upcoming deepwater piers. If I were to offer 0% tariffs to foreign SOC trade ships, their capital would collapse within a decade, destroying the economic strength of the very ally I was trying to cultivate. Tariff parity ensured that both our ports grew rich together rather than engaging in a destructive, race-to-the-bottom price war that would only benefit foreign SOC merchants. And third, Ethan added, leaning over the table toward the brass box, the profit split on these compasses will be 50-50, but the manufacturing rights remain strictly in Driftmark's shipyards under Velaryon oversight. No foundry on Dragonstone will produce the finished compasses without my master artificers present. My smirk returned, wider this time. Deal, Lord Ethan, provided my specialized key and acidfiel safety mechanisms remain my own private intellectual property, kept strictly in my vault. In truth, this third term was a pretty good move in negotiation on my part. He had intentionally started our hidden framework expecting me to push me up from a 50-50 split to a 60-40. Giving Ethan that apparent win at the made him feel like he had driven a bargain. More importantly, by offloading the actual manufacturing to Driftmark, House Velaryon would be forced to pay 100% of the factory setups, metal smithing, labor wages, and raw material costs. Meanwhile, I would sit back on Dragonstone and collect a pure 50% profit simply for supplying the magnetized needle cores I forged myself. Keeping the secret acidfiel antitamper mechanism locked in my own hands ensured that I retained absolute control over the product. If anyone ever tried to open the inner casing without my specific brass key, the file would shatter, eating the needle in a cloud of smoking rust and rendering the device useless. Giving Ethan these minor economic victories gave him the exact leverage he needed to swallow the biggest, most dangerous pill of all, breaking Alyssa's implicit betrothal with Prince Aenys and backing my play against the crown's traditional line of succession. Ethan let out a long, quiet breath, shaking his head slowly as he reached his broad, calloused hand out across the dark oak table. You are not at all what I expected, Prince Maegor, Ethan muttered begrudgingly, a deep frown etched into his brow even as his grip locked onto my gloved hand like forged steel. Now, let us discuss the specifics. Read up to 20 chapters ahead on my Patreon, patreon.com/dekiru77. To be continued.